The air inside the Atlanta courthouse hung thick and oppressive, a silence so dense it seemed to press against the towering walls, as though the very room was holding its breath. The morning sun spilled through the grand windows, casting long golden streaks across the polished marble floors, illuminating every corner of the space where justice was meant to reign supreme. Yet, for those inside, the weight of what was about to unfold made the light feel like a false promise. Officer Jonathan Bryant stood at the center of it all, his uniform impeccably pressed. Every crease sharp enough to cut through the tension. His posture was rigid, unyielding, his broad shoulders squared as if he were a statue carved from stone. But it was the arrogance radiating from him, raw, unfiltered, and deliberate, that truly filled the room. His cold, steely eyes glared across the space. Locked onto the woman seated behind the judge's bench, Judge Ian Williams. To him, she wasn't an authority figure, she was an affront, a challenge to everything he believed he embodied. His gaze bore into her with a defiance that screamed she had no right to sit there, no right to wield power over him. This wasn't just a man resisting the law, it was a man rejecting her very existence in that seat of judgment. Ian felt the weight of his stare like a physical force. But she'd encountered it before, too many times to count. It was the look of a man who'd spent decades wrapped in the delusion of his own invincibility. A man who'd never once been forced to reckon with the consequences of his actions. She could see it in the way he held himself, the way his lips curled ever so slightly at the corners. As though the world owed him its submission. He'd walked into countless rooms just like this one, expecting everyone to bend, to cower, to fall in line. But today, in her courtroom, that arrogance would find no foothold. Her heart beat steadily beneath her black robe, each thump a reminder of the battles she'd fought to claim this seat. She straightened her spine. Her dark eyes meeting his without a flicker of hesitation, and when she spoke, her voice cut through the silence like a blade, firm, unwavering, absolute. "Officer, take your seat." The words landed like a command carved in stone, but Bryant didn't budge. Instead, a slow, mocking chuckle rumbled from his chest. His head shaking in disbelief as if she'd just told him the most absurd joke imaginable. He leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the edge of the table, fingers splayed wide. And when he spoke, his voice dripped with venom, each syllable laced with deliberate malice. "I don't take orders from people like you." The room stiffened instantly. A collective intake of breath as his words hung in the air, heavy with their unspoken meaning. The clerks froze mid-motion, pens hovering over papers. The bailiffs shifted uneasily, their eyes darting between the officer and the judge. The few spectators in the gallery, legal aides, a journalist scribbling notes, an elderly woman clutching her purse, squirmed in their seats. The discomfort palpable. Everyone waited, watching, wondering how she'd respond to the blatant disrespect, the barely veiled threat beneath his tone. But Ian wasn't shaken. She'd faced men like him before, men who wore their power like armor, who wielded it like a weapon, who thought intimidation was their birthright. She knew their playbook, their tricks. Their fragile egos masquerading as strength. She wouldn't rise to his bait. Her voice remained steady, calm yet commanding, as she replied, "This is a court of law. You will sit down. Or you will be removed." The words were a lifeline, an opportunity for him to back down, to preserve some shred of dignity. But Bryant's smirk only widened. His eyes glinting with a dangerous mix of amusement and defiance. "I'd love to see you try," he shot back, his tone daring her to make good on the threat. What happened next was so swift, so brutal. It shattered the room's fragile stillness like a thunderclap. His fist lashed out, striking her face with a force that echoed through the cavernous space, a sickening crack that reverberated off the walls. Her head snapped to the side, a sharp gasp escaping her lips as pain exploded across her cheek. The courtroom erupted in chaos, a woman in the gallery screamed, a high-pitched wail that pierced the air. Papers fluttered to the floor as a clerk leapt to his feet, knocking over a stack of files. The bailiffs jolted forward, momentarily stunned by the audacity of the act. Bryant stepped back. His chest heaving, his breaths coming in short, ragged bursts. He stood there, fists still clenched, a twisted satisfaction flickering in his eyes as if he'd just righted some cosmic wrong. As if his violence had restored the natural order he believed in. Ian stumbled, her hand instinctively reaching for the bench to steady herself. The metallic tang of blood filled her mouth. Warm and slick as it trickled from her split lip. For a fleeting moment, the pain threatened to overwhelm her, a white-hot surge that blurred her vision. But she wouldn't fall. Not here. Not now. Not for him. She refused to give him the triumph of seeing her break. Slowly, deliberately, she lifted her head, her fingers brushing the blood from her chin, smearing it across her skin like war paint. Her eyes found his again, and in that locked gaze, something shifted. The room didn't see a victim recoiling in defeat, they saw a tempest gathering strength, a force of nature ready to unleash its fury. For the briefest second, Bryant's arrogance faltered. A crack in his armor as uncertainty flashed across his face. Perhaps he'd expected tears, a collapse, a surrender to his show of dominance. But Ian wasn't that woman. She straightened her robe with a slow, measured grace, the fabric rustling softly as she drew a deep, steadying breath. Her hand reached for the gavel, not to call for order, but to wield it as a weapon of her own. When she spoke, her voice rang out, clear and sharp as tempered steel, slicing through the chaos. "Officer, you just assaulted a sitting judge in a court of law." The room held its breath, every eye fixed on her, every ear straining to catch her next move. Bryant took a step forward. His mouth opening as if to argue, to double down on his defiance, but she raised a hand, silencing him before he could utter a word. "Bailiffs, arrest him." The two bailiffs hesitated, exchanging quick, uncertain glances. They were men who'd worked this courthouse for years, Tom, a stocky veteran with graying hair and a perpetual frown, and Marcus, younger, wary, his hands twitching nervously at his sides. They knew Bryant, had shared coffee with him in the break room, had laughed at his stories of keeping the streets in line. He was one of their own. A brother in uniform. But they also knew Ian, knew the fire in her, the unshakable resolve that had earned her respect even from those who whispered about her behind closed doors. The weight of her command pressed down on them, and for a moment, they stood frozen, caught between loyalty and duty. Bryant sensed their reluctance and seized it. His confidence surging back like a tide. "You can't do this," he hissed, his voice low and menacing as he struggled against the bailiff's tentative grip. "Do you know who I am?" His hands twitched, his body tensing as if he might lash out again. But Ian stepped closer, unflinching, her gaze piercing through him. "No," she said, her voice steady as granite, "but after today, everyone will." The first cuff clicked around his wrist, the sound sharp and final, like the tolling of a bell. His face twisted in disbelief, then rage, as the second cuff followed. He thrashed briefly, his boots scuffing the marble floor, but the bailiffs held firm now, their hesitation melting under the heat of her authority. In that instant, the balance shifted, not just in the courtroom, but in the very foundation of Bryant's world. For years, he'd walked these streets cloaked in untouchability, shielded by a system that bent to protect its own. But now, that shield cracked. And the consequences he'd never faced came rushing in like a flood. The lesson was stark and unforgiving: power, when abused, invites its own reckoning. Justice, Ian knew, wasn't just a word, it was a force, one she'd vowed to wield since she was a girl watching her father's life unravel in a courtroom not unlike this one. And as Bryant was dragged away, his shouts echoing down the hall, she stood tall, blood still staining her lip, a symbol of resilience and retribution. The events of that day were only the beginning. Whispers spread through the courthouse, then the city, about the officer who'd dared to strike a judge, and the judge who'd refused to yield. The truth. When it fully emerged, Bryant's years of unchecked brutality, the complaints buried, the lives he'd shattered, would shake Atlanta to its core. Those who'd once shielded him, his fellow officers, his superiors, would find their excuses crumbling, their loyalty tested. For Ian, it was a victory hard won, a testament to the justice she'd sworn to uphold. And for Bryant, it was the dawn of a reality he'd never imagined, a world where power no longer guaranteed immunity, where the consequences of his actions finally found him. The courtroom, bathed once more in silence, stood as a witness to the fall of a tyrant and the rise of a storm that would not be silenced. The courthouse loomed like a fortress of stone and shadow as Officer Bryant strode through its heavy wooden doors, his polished boots striking the marble floor with a rhythm that demanded attention. Heads swiveled in his wake, some dipped in quiet reverence, others tilted toward one another as hushed whispers rippled through the air. He could feel the weight of their stares. The rumors that clung to him like smoke, reckless, they called him, a man who danced too close to the edge, who bent the world to his will. But Bryant didn't flinch under their scrutiny. Let them talk. He'd clawed his way up through years of grit and sacrifice, forging a name that carried power, a name that meant something. And now, to be summoned here, forced to bow before someone like her? It was a betrayal of everything he'd built, an insult that churned deep in his gut. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere thickened, heavy with unspoken stakes. The wooden benches creaked under the shifting weight of onlookers, attorneys in pressed suits, clerks clutching stacks of paper, jurors with wide, uncertain eyes. The air felt charged, electric, as if it might spark and ignite at the slightest provocation. Bryant stepped forward, his uniform sharp and immaculate, every crease a testament to the control he wielded over his world. His chest swelled with unshakable confidence, a man who'd faced down chaos and walked away unscathed. His gaze landed on Judge Ian as she settled into her seat behind the towering bench, her robes pooling around her like a dark tide. Their eyes locked, a silent clash of wills, neither willing to yield. She didn't blink. Neither did he. Her voice sliced through the tension first, steady and commanding, a blade wrapped in velvet. "Officer Bryant, please take the stand." The words hung there, an order masquerading as a request. For a heartbeat, he didn't move. He let the silence stretch, his lips curling faintly as he studied her, testing the steel in her spine. Then, deliberately, he advanced, his boots thudding against the polished floor, each step a declaration. He wasn't here to cower. When he reached the stand, he dropped into the chair with a casual swagger, leaning back, arms crossed over his chest. A smirk played across his face, daring her to believe she could rattle him. Ian adjusted her glasses. Her movements precise, unhurried. She'd seen this before, too many times. The arrogance radiating from him was nothing new. A familiar stench she'd encountered in men who wore their authority like armor, who bristled at the very idea of answering to her. Their resentment simmered beneath the surface. A quiet rage at the sight of her perched above them, gavel in hand. She didn't care if they liked her. She wasn't here for their approval. Her eyes bore into his, unflinching. "Officer Bryant, you are aware that you are under oath?" He exhaled sharply through his nose, a sound laced with impatience, and gave a curt nod. "Yeah." Her tone remained steady. A calm sea hiding treacherous currents. "Then let's begin." The questioning started innocently enough, a routine exchange of facts and formalities. But as the minutes ticked by, Ian's voice grew sharper, her words methodical yet relentless, peeling back the layers of his carefully crafted report. She zeroed in on discrepancies, dates that didn't align, Details that shifted under scrutiny, gaps he couldn't fill. Each question landed like a stone, chipping away at the foundation of his story. The smirk on Bryant's face faltered, his jaw tightening as he felt the walls closing in. His fingers began to tap against the wooden armrest, a restless rhythm betraying the storm brewing inside him. The room watched, breathless, sensing the shift. She was dismantling him, piece by piece, exposing him in a way he hadn't anticipated. And he hated her for it. He needed to take back control. Leaning forward slightly, his voice dropped to a low growl, thick with menace. "You know, Judge, it's funny. People like you always think they're untouchable, sitting up there pulling strings. But step outside these walls, and it's a whole different game, isn't it?" The threat lingered, a dark promise wrapped in silk. The courtroom fell into a stunned hush, the air growing heavier, pressing against every chest in the room. Ian felt the weight of every gaze, attorneys, clerks, jurors, all waiting to see how she'd react. Her pulse thrummed in her ears, but she didn't waver. She met his stare head-on, her face a mask of iron resolve. Then, with a voice as cold and unshakable as the bench she sat on, she said, "Officer Bryant, you will watch your tone in my courtroom." Something flickered in his eyes, anger, defiance, a crack in the facade he'd worn so effortlessly. And then, in an instant, that crack split wide open. He erupted from the chair, a blur of motion too swift to track. His fist arced through the air, crashing against her jaw with a sound that echoed like a gunshot. Pain exploded across her face, a white-hot burst that sent her reeling back in her seat. The courtroom dissolved into chaos, gasps tore through the silence, a woman's scream pierced the air, while others sat frozen, mouths agape, unable to process the unthinkable. Bryant stepped back, his chest heaving, knuckles pale and streaked with red. For a fleeting moment, triumph flashed across his face. A savage pride in having struck her down. He stood there, towering over the scene, as if he'd finally asserted the dominance he'd always believed was his. But then, something shifted. Ian didn't crumple. Slowly, deliberately, she straightened, her movements measured despite the blood trickling from the corner of her mouth. She didn't lift a hand to wipe it away. She simply stared at him, her expression unreadable, a stillness that unnerved him more than any outburst could. And then, impossibly, she smiled, a small, chilling curve of her lips that sent a shiver racing down his spine. His confidence fractured, crumbling like dry earth underfoot. The room held its breath, suspended in a moment that felt eternal. When she spoke, her voice was low, deliberate, and laced with a quiet fury that cut deeper than any shout. "You just made the worst mistake of your life." Bryant had spent years building a life where he answered to no one, where his badge was a shield and a sword, where the rules bent to his will. He'd walked through fire and emerged unscathed. Untouchable, or so he'd thought. But today, that illusion was unraveling. The courtroom stood still, a tableau of disbelief and dread, the air itself seeming to constrict around them. A judge, his judge, had been struck in her own domain, in front of a full assembly of witnesses. It was an act that didn't just defy decorum, it shattered the very pillars of justice, leaving them trembling in its wake. Ian's cheek pulsed with a searing ache, the skin already swelling beneath the blow. But she barely registered it. She'd endured worse, blows that didn't mark the flesh but scarred the soul, wounds carved by a world that had never made space for her. This was nothing. The pain was fleeting. What mattered was the reckoning that would follow. She drew a slow breath, steadying the fire roaring in her chest, and fixed her gaze on Bryant. He stood there, wild-eyed, his breaths coming in ragged bursts, his knuckles still clenched as if ready to strike again. That smirk crept back, slow and deliberate. A taunt that sent a fresh wave of rage surging through her veins. The room teetered on the brink of anarchy. The bailiffs, usually swift and decisive, hesitated. Their hands hovering near their belts, caught in a moment of paralyzing indecision. Attorneys murmured in frantic, disjointed bursts, their eyes darting between Ian and Bryant, waiting for the next move. She exhaled, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "You think you can walk away from this?" It wasn't a question, it was a truth, raw and unyielding. Because that's who Bryant was, a man who'd spent his life breaking boundaries, wielding his power like a club, and never once facing the consequences. Until now. She took a step forward. And the shift was palpable. The court reporter's fingers froze above the keys, the whispers died mid-sentence, the bailiffs snapped to attention. But before she could continue, another voice broke through, a sharp, commanding bark that sliced the tension like a whip. "Judge Williams." It was Chief Bailiff Henderson. A broad-shouldered man with graying hair and a face carved from years of quiet loyalty. He'd stood by her side for a decade, a steady presence she'd always trusted. But now, there was an edge to his tone, a warning that made her pause. She turned, her eyes locking onto his, and in that fleeting glance, she understood. He wasn't looking at her. His gaze was fixed on the far side of the room, where Bryant's fellow officers stood clustered near the door. Their faces weren't etched with shock or outrage, but with something darker, a coiled, simmering tension. Their hands rested near their holsters, their postures rigid, watchful. They weren't horrified that Bryant had struck her, they were waiting to see if she'd dare to retaliate. If she'd threaten one of their own. The realization hit her like a cold wind, this wasn't just about Bryant. It was about them, all of them, and the fragile thread of loyalty that bound them together. For a long moment, Ian said nothing. She let the truth settle over her, heavy and suffocating, as every eye in the room burned into her skin. She'd spent her life playing by the rules. Clawing her way up through a system that had never welcomed her, trusting that justice would hold. But the rules had never shielded her, had never held men like Bryant accountable. He knew it too, that's why he'd swung, why he smirked even now, believing he'd walk away unscathed. She took another breath, her heartbeat slowing to a steady, deliberate thud. Then, with a calm that belied the storm within, she turned back to him. "You just assaulted a sitting judge," she said, her voice a quiet thunder that rolled through the room. Bryant's smirk faltered. Just for a second, as the weight of her words sank in. He'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and for the first time, doubt flickered in his eyes. Ian didn't flinch, didn't waver. She stood there, blood staining her chin, her gaze unyielding, a pillar of strength in a world that had underestimated her one too many times. Justice wasn't just a concept, it was a force. And she wielded it now with a clarity that cut through the chaos. Power, when abused, demanded a price, and Bryant was about to learn that lesson the hard way. The courtroom remained still. The air thick with the promise of consequences, as the echoes of his actions reverberated far beyond the walls that confined them. In the cavernous expanse of the courtroom, Bryant's voice cut through the air, smooth yet unyielding, like steel draped in the softest velvet. His face remained a mask of unshakable confidence, but if anything, the faint smirk tugging at his lips widened as he uttered that single, brazen word. It exploded into the silence, sharp and jarring, reverberating off the polished wooden walls like the crack of a gunshot. In that electrifying instant, Ayanna felt a surge of clarity pierce through the fog of her thoughts. She knew, with every fiber of her being, what she had to do. But she wouldn't act rashly, no, not yet. She refused to give him the satisfaction of a hurried, sloppy reaction. Bryant had spent years cloaked in the delusion of his own invincibility, strutting through life as if no one could touch him. Now, she intended to strip that illusion away. Layer by excruciating layer, until he felt the suffocating weight of his own deeds pressing down on him, the consequences he'd dodged for so long finally sinking their teeth into his flesh. So Ayanna didn't raise her voice. She didn't hurl accusations or demand retribution in a way that could be spun against her, twisted into some narrative of hysteria or weakness. Instead, she turned her gaze to the chief bailiff, her eyes steady and piercing, and spoke with a calm that sent chills rippling through the room. "Clear the courtroom," she said. Her words ringing out with a crystalline precision that left no room for doubt. A murmur of bewilderment swept through the space like a sudden gust of wind. Attorneys froze mid-conversation, their heads swiveling toward one another in silent confusion. Reporters gripped their notebooks tighter, their knuckles widening as they scribbled furiously. Sensing the story unfolding before them was about to take a seismic turn. Even the bailiffs, those stoic figures accustomed to maintaining order, hesitated, their boots scuffing faintly against the floor as they exchanged uncertain glances. Bryant, leaning casually against the railing, let out a low, mocking chuckle that dripped with condescension. "Scared, Judge?" he taunted, his tone laced with amusement. Ayanna didn't so much as blink. "I said," she repeated, her voice unwavering, a pillar of steel amid the shifting chaos. "Clear the courtroom." The chief bailiff, a burly man with a weathered face and graying hair, swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed visibly as he wrestled with the weight of her command. Then, with a curt nod, he turned and gestured sharply to the room. One by one, people began to move, slowly at first, their footsteps tentative, their bodies heavy with reluctance. A clerk clutched a stack of papers to her chest, her wide eyes darting between Ayanna and Bryant as she shuffled toward the exit. A reporter lingered near the back, pen still poised above his pad, as if hoping to catch one last whispered word. Some stole furtive glances over their shoulders, their gazes flickering between the judge and the officer. Sensing the air crackling with the promise of something monumental about to unfold, Bryant watched it all with an air of detached amusement at first, his arms crossed, his posture relaxed. But as the room steadily emptied, a flicker of unease crept into his expression. This wasn't how he'd pictured it. He'd expected her to erupt, to scream, to give him the raw, messy emotion he could mock or manipulate. He'd anticipated tears streaming down her face, her voice breaking as she begged for justice, something he could dismiss with a wave of his hand. What he hadn't bargained for was this, her unshakable silence, deliberate and precise, a blade honed to a lethal edge. Minutes ticked by, each one stretching longer than the last, until the heavy double doors finally thudded shut. The courtroom, once buzzing with life, now stood eerily still. Only a handful remained, Ayanna, Bryant, the chief bailiff, and a pair of officers who lingered near the walls, their hands clasped behind their backs, their faces taut with anticipation. Ayanna exhaled slowly, a measured breath that seemed to steady the very air around her. She lifted her chin, her presence filling the room like a storm gathering strength on the horizon. Then, with a calm that belied the fire blazing in her chest, she reached for her gavel. Bryant's smirk flickered back to life, but beneath it, something unsteady stirred, a crack in his armor he couldn't quite conceal. For the first time, uncertainty gnawed at him. He didn't know what she'd do next, and that lack of control, more than anything else, sent a shiver of fear crawling up his spine. Ayanna tapped the gavel once, the sound crisp and deliberate, a single note that seemed to hang in the air like a tolling bell. Then she spoke, her voice slicing through the silence with surgical precision. "Officer Bryant," she said, pausing just long enough to let the weight of his name settle, "you are under arrest." The silence that followed was deafening, a void so thick it seemed to swallow every sound, every breath. But what came next defied all expectation. Ayanna's words didn't merely fill the room, they crushed it, compressing the vast space until it felt claustrophobic, the walls inching closer, the ceiling pressing down. Every inhale felt labored. Every second stretched into an eternity, and every soul still present couldn't escape the crushing gravity of what had just transpired. The chief bailiff stood rooted to the spot. His mouth slightly agape as if he'd meant to protest but thought better of it. His hands, usually steady from years of enforcing order, trembled faintly at his sides, betraying the storm of doubt swirling within him. The officers flanking the room went rigid, their shoulders squared, their fingers twitching as they grappled with the reality unfolding before them. Attorneys, clerks, and the few reporters who'd lingered near the exits, all of them stood frozen, their eyes locked on the scene, as if moving might shatter the fragile tension holding the moment together. And there, at the heart of it all, was Jonathan Bryant, the man who'd built his life on the unshakable belief that he was untouchable. For years, he'd wielded his badge like a scepter, his authority a shield against any consequence. He'd smirked his way through complaints, shrugged off suspensions, and walked away from every reprimand unscathed. But now, he stood with his fists still clenched, his body trembling with the aftershocks of his own rage. Moments earlier, he'd done the unthinkable, striking a sitting judge in her own courtroom, his fist connecting with her jaw in a burst of unchecked fury. Disbelief clouded his features now, his lips parting as his eyes darted frantically around the room, searching for some sign that this wasn't real, that this couldn't be real. Surely someone, anyone, would step in, laugh it off, tell him Ayana's declaration was nothing but hollow bravado. That's how it had always been. Every civilian who dared to challenge him, every whisper of accountability, it had all dissolved into nothing. Men like him didn't fall. But this time, the air felt different. The silence grew denser, more oppressive, wrapping around him like a noose tightening with each passing second. He let out a short, incredulous laugh, shaking his head as if he could dispel the moment with sheer willpower. "You're kidding," he muttered, his voice sharp but fraying at the edges. A desperate attempt to convince himself as much as anyone else. Ayana didn't flinch, didn't shift, didn't even acknowledge his feeble deflection. She simply held his gaze, her eyes a mirror reflecting the cold, unyielding truth he refused to face. Bryant's breath came out in a harsh, uneven burst, his chest heaving. "This is a joke," he said, louder now, his tone tinged with the first threads of panic. He spun on his heel, scanning the faces of the officers who'd once been his unwavering allies. "You can't seriously be going along with this. She's making a scene, she's trying to humiliate me. You all see what this is, right?" No one moved. No one spoke. The officers, men who'd stood shoulder to shoulder with him through countless shifts, men who'd laughed off his excesses and covered his tracks, now hesitated. Their eyes flicked toward Ayana, then back to him, uncertainty etching lines into their weathered faces. For the first time in his career, they weren't sure. And that realization hit Bryant like a blow to the gut. A shadow passed over his face, something dark, something raw and ugly twisting his features into a mask of barely contained fury. He whirled back to Ayana, his eyes narrowing to slits. "You think you can do this?" he hissed, his voice low and venomous, a warning teetering on the edge of a threat. She didn't blink. "I already did." Bryant's body went taut, his breath catching in his throat. For a fleeting moment, she saw it, the fracture in his composure, the hairline crack splitting through his carefully constructed facade. He scrambled to patch it, to claw back the control slipping through his fingers. But it was too late. The tide had turned. The chief bailiff took a single step forward, the sound of his boot against the floor ringing out like a gunshot in the stillness. It was a small movement, but it ignited the moment, making everything feel suddenly, devastatingly real. "Officer Bryant," Ayana said, her voice a beacon of authority cutting through the haze. "You are under arrest for the assault of a sitting judge in a court of law." The words crashed into him like a tidal wave. His jaw clenched so tightly it seemed his teeth might shatter. His nostrils flaring as he fought the reality collapsing around him. When he spoke, his voice was a guttural snarl, barely human. "You don't know what you're doing." Ayanna stepped closer, unflinching. Her presence a quiet storm. "You assaulted me in front of an entire courtroom," she said, each word deliberate, heavy with the weight of truth. "In front of officers, in front of cameras. Do you really think there's a way out of this?" Bryant's chest rose and fell in jagged, uneven gasps. "You don't get it," he spat, his voice dripping with a dangerous certainty. "You think the law's on your side? You think any of this matters?" He shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping him. "People like you don't win against people like me." Ayanna tilted her head ever so slightly, her expression unreadable yet piercing. "And yet," she said softly, "here we are." His fingers twitched at his sides, and for a brief, heart-stopping moment, she saw it, the flicker of temptation in his eyes. The wild, instinctual thought that maybe, just maybe, if he reached for his gun, he could erase this moment. Reclaim his dominance in one reckless act. Ayanna's pulse quickened, a faint drumbeat beneath her calm exterior, but she didn't move, didn't waver. She simply watched him. Her silence a challenge he couldn't meet. Slowly, agonizingly, he relented. His fingers uncurled, his shoulders sagged just a fraction. But the rage simmering in his gaze burned brighter than ever, a hatred so potent it seemed to sear the air between them. In that moment, the lesson was unmistakable. Justice, when wielded with unwavering resolve, could topple even the most arrogant abuser of power. Bryant had thrived on the belief that his actions bore no repercussions. That his authority placed him above the law. But Ayanna's stand, quiet, calculated, and resolute, proved otherwise. The consequences he'd evaded for years had finally caught up, their weight inescapable. And as the officers stepped forward, their movements slow but inevitable, the room bore witness to a truth as old as time: power unchecked breeds corruption, but justice, patient and deliberate, will always find a way to balance the scales. Beneath the courtroom's oppressive stillness, a storm churned silently within the chief bailiff. His weathered hand stretched out. Fingers steady but heavy with intent, a mute order slicing through the tension. Brian, or rather, Jonathan Bryant, as the world once knew him, stood rigid, his lips clamped into a thin, trembling line. His face, once a mask of unshakable authority, had become a fortress, sealed tight against the tidal wave of reality crashing down. His dark eyes flickered, betraying nothing to the onlookers. Though inside, a chaotic whirl of denial and dread clawed at his chest. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted a hand toward the badge pinned over his heart, a gleaming symbol of the power he'd wielded like a scepter for decades. His fingers hovered there, trembling ever so slightly. As if touching it might burn him, as if letting it go would unravel the very fabric of who he was. Then, with a sudden, jagged motion born of defiance and despair, he tore it free. The badge hit the polished floor with a sharp, metallic clatter, a sound that ricocheted off the courtroom's high walls like a gunshot. It was a bitter, resounding confession: the world, for once, refused to bow to his will. But the story didn't end there, not yet. Stripped bare of his badge, his title, his invincibility, Bryant stood exposed. A fallen titan in a room that seemed to shrink around him. The air grew thick, suffocating, as the massive double doors at the far end of the chamber groaned open. Beyond them waited a frenzy, a swarm of reporters, their cameras flashing like lightning, their voices rising in a cacophony of shouted questions. The world had come to feast on his ruin. What had begun as a quiet courtroom reckoning was no longer contained within these walls, it had erupted into a national spectacle. Bryant's face twisted, his features contorting into a mask of raw, unfiltered horror as the chief bailiff stepped forward. The older man's grip was iron, unyielding, as he seized Bryant's wrists. The cold bite of handcuffs snapped shut around them. The metallic click reverberating through the silence, a sound that seemed to pierce Bryant's soul. He didn't flinch, not at first. His jaw clenched tighter, his nostrils flared, and his chest heaved as if he could will the moment away. But beneath that stoic exterior, disbelief festered. This couldn't be happening, not to him, the untouchable Jonathan Bryant. The officer who'd spent a lifetime bending the law to his whims, certain that consequences were for lesser men. Across the room stood Ayanna, her presence a quiet force amidst the chaos. She didn't cheer or smirk, she didn't need to. Her victory was etched in the scene unfolding before her. For years, she'd carried the weight of his arrogance, his abuses, waiting for the day the scales of justice might tip. Now, as the cuffs locked around his wrists, as the cameras captured his descent, she simply watched, her face serene, her eyes steady, her silence louder than any shout of triumph. This wasn't about gloating, it was about the slow, inevitable grind of accountability catching up to a man who'd believed himself beyond its reach. The chief bailiff tugged at Bryant's arm, guiding him toward the open doors where the press waited like vultures circling a fresh kill. But Bryant resisted. His polished shoes scuffing against the floor as he dug in his heels, stopping just shy of the threshold. His breathing grew ragged, uneven. His fingers twitching at his sides as if searching for a weapon, a lifeline, anything to claw his way out of this abyss. His mind raced, a frantic storm of half-formed plans and fading hopes. Then, something inside him fractured. "This isn't over," he hissed, his voice low and venomous, slicing through the air just loud enough for Ayanna to catch. He turned his head, his gaze locking onto hers, his lips curling into a sneer that barely masked the desperation beneath. "You think you've won? You think they'll let this stand?" His words dripped with rage, each syllable a dagger aimed at her composure. His body stiffened, his chest rising and falling with barely contained fury. "You don't understand how this works, Judge. You never did." Ayanna didn't blink. She stood rooted, her posture unyielding, her expression a calm sea hiding depths of resolve. She offered him nothing, no flinch, no retort, no crack in her armor, and that void infuriated him more than any words could have. "I know people," he pressed on, his voice dropping to a guttural growl, trembling with a mix of bravado and fear. "You think the DA's going to let this slide? You think the department's just going to sit back and watch one of their own go down because of—" He stopped himself, the unspoken word hanging between them like a guillotine blade. They both knew what he'd nearly said, and the silence that followed was sharper than any insult. Ayanna tilted her head slightly, her voice emerging soft but piercing, cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "One of their own." She let the phrase linger, watching as Bryant's throat tightened, his facade splintering. "And what does that mean, Officer Bryant?" He had no answer, none he could voice, at least, because the truth was a mirror he'd avoided for years. His entire career, his identity, had been forged in the crucible of loyalty, protection, and unspoken favors. He'd thrived as, one of them, a man shielded by a system that swept his sins under the rug. Until today. Ayanna stepped closer, her movement deliberate, shrinking the distance between them until her words pressed against him like a physical weight. "You walked into this courtroom convinced you were untouchable," she said, her tone almost gentle, but laced with an edge that cut deeper than any shout. "You struck a sitting judge, me, in front of witnesses, officers, cameras, and yet you still believed you'd walk away unscathed. Tell me, Bryant, what does it feel like to lose?" The question struck like a hammer, and something in him snapped. His body lurched forward, a primal instinct to lash out, to reclaim control, but the chief bailiff's grip tightened, yanking him back with a force that made him stumble. His breath came in harsh, jagged gasps, his pulse hammering in his neck, his chest heaving as if he might explode. "You don't get to do this to me." He spat, his voice cracking, the last threads of restraint unraveling. "You think you're different? You think you matter? You're nothing, just another name they'll forget. Another headline that'll fade." Ayanna took another step forward, and this time, Bryant flinched. He didn't even realize he'd stepped back, his retreat instinctive. A cornered animal sensing the trap closing in. That single, unconscious movement shattered him. For the first time, fear flickered in his eyes, fear of her, of the moment. Of the world beyond those doors. He wasn't the predator anymore, he was prey, stripped of power, exposed and vulnerable. The realization crashed over him like a wave, drowning the man he'd once been. He was no longer the untouchable officer, the one who commanded respect and instilled terror. He was just a figure in cuffs, a criminal awaiting judgment, and soon the entire world would see him as such. The doors burst open wider, and the chaos spilled inside. Camera flashes seared the air, blinding and relentless, as reporters surged forward. Their voices a deafening roar. "Officer Bryant, do you have a statement? Judge Williams, how do you feel about the arrest? Bryant, is it true you have a history of excessive force?" The questions hammered him from every angle, overlapping into a merciless barrage. Then came the killing blow. An intern from a major network thrust a tablet forward, the screen glowing with raw, unedited footage of Bryant's fist crashing into Ayanna's face inside the courtroom. Within seconds, it spread, uploaded, shared, broadcasted to millions. Phones buzzed, screens lit up. And the world watched in real time as Jonathan Bryant's empire of arrogance crumbled. The fallout was swift and brutal. The DA's office issued a condemnation within minutes. Their words sharp and unequivocal. The mayor distanced himself with a cold, calculated statement, washing his hands of the scandal. Even Bryant's own department, his fortress, his family, released a terse announcement about an investigation, but the tone was icy, detached, a clear signal that no one was coming to his rescue. For the first time, he felt the sting of abandonment, the hollowness of a system he'd manipulated for years now turning its back on him. He'd spent his life believing power was eternal. That men like him could never fall. Now, as the squad car's door slammed shut behind him, as Ayanna stood atop the courthouse steps watching his silhouette fade, he tasted the bitter truth. Invincibility was a lie, and justice, however delayed, was relentless. The chief bailiff, too, lingered in the aftermath, his grizzled face etched with a quiet satisfaction he'd never voice. He'd seen men like Bryant rise and fall, had carried the weight of their arrogance in silence. Today, his steady hands had locked the cuffs, and though he'd never admit it, there was a flicker of pride in that act, a belief that the law, flawed as it was, could still bite back. As the car pulled away, the crowd's shouts fading into the distance, Ayanna remained, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She'd expected defiance from Bryant, a final snarl or curse, but his silence spoke louder. What happens when a man who's lived as a god discovers he's mortal? What happens when the shields he trusted, his badge, his allies, his reputation, crumble to dust? For Bryant, the answer was unfolding in every headline, every whisper, every judgment cast upon him. For Ayanna, it was a lesson carved in stone: power abused invites its own reckoning, and justice, though patient, never forgets. The air inside the courthouse felt thick and heavy, clinging to Ayanna like a second skin as she stood motionless in her chambers. Outside, the world was erupting. Bryant's arrest had ignited a firestorm that no one could contain. The video of him, once a towering figure of authority, now reduced to a man in shackles, had spread like wildfire across every screen in the nation. News anchors pored over each frame with surgical precision, their voices buzzing through the airwaves as they dissected the chaos. Political pundits filled the airways with grand theories about what it all meant, while social media became a roaring furnace of raw emotion, rage from some, grim satisfaction from others, and a deep, jagged divide splitting the rest. The image of Bryant, his uniform crumpled and his wrists bound, being dragged from the very building he'd once swaggered through with untouchable confidence, had seared itself into the collective mind of the country. It was a moment of reckoning, but Ayanna knew better than anyone that justice was never a tidy affair. It was messy, brutal, and unrelenting. She stepped back into the courthouse, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor, each sound swallowed by the clamor of the crowd outside. Reporters swarmed like vultures, their cameras flashing in a relentless barrage, their shouted questions blending into a deafening roar. The weight of it all pressed against her chest, a physical force she could feel in her bones. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The story was still unfolding, spiraling outward in unpredictable waves, and she was caught in its undertow. Inside the shadowed halls of power, the machinery of the system churned. Behind closed doors, men and women in crisp suits whispered urgently, their phones buzzing with calls, their inboxes flooding with emails. They were strategizing, calculating, plotting their next moves with the precision of chess masters. This wasn't just about Bryant anymore, this was about the crumbling facade of a system that had shielded him for years. His fall had exposed its cracks, and now those in charge faced a stark choice: abandon him to save themselves or cling to him and risk sinking into the abyss alongside him. The first ripple of trouble hit an hour later. Ayanna sat alone in her chambers, her palms pressed flat against the cool wood of her desk, her eyes locked on the laptop screen. The news ticker scrolled endlessly, each word a fresh stab of tension. Bryant's lawyer had stepped into the spotlight, his voice smooth and defiant as he addressed the press. There was no hint of remorse in his statement, only a calculated counterattack. Officer Bryant was unjustly arrested in a moment of heightened emotion, he declared, his tone dripping with indignation. What we witnessed today was not justice, it was a travesty, fueled by political agendas and personal grudges. We will exhaust every legal avenue to ensure that Officer Bryant's rights are upheld. Ayanna's jaw tightened until it ached. They were spinning the story, twisting the truth into a grotesque distortion. Bryant, the man who'd wielded his badge like a weapon, was now being painted as the victim, a martyr wronged by a vengeful system. The headlines followed like obedient soldiers: Officer Bryant breaks silence, I was targeted, and police union slams arrest, demands probe into Judge Williams. Her phone began to hum, a relentless vibration that rattled against the desk. Texts poured in, first one, then two, then a deluge. Friends offered cautious encouragement, colleagues murmured words of concern. Legal advisors urged her to tread carefully. But one message cut through the noise like a blade. It was brief, stark, and unsigned: they're coming for you. She let out a slow, deliberate breath, the air hissing through her teeth. She'd seen this coming from the moment she'd given the order, from the instant the cuffs had snapped shut around Bryant's wrists. From the second she'd glimpsed the flicker of fear in his cold, defiant eyes. Men like him didn't bow to consequences, they clawed and fought, backed by a system that had been built to protect them. And now, that system was turning its gaze on her. By the next morning, the retaliation unfurled with chilling efficiency. A formal review of her conduct was announced. The news delivered with the sterile formality of a press release. Anonymous whispers began to leak into the media, claims that she'd acted rashly, that her emotions had clouded her judgment, that she'd overreached her authority. The police union wasted no time, issuing a furious demand for a full investigation into her actions. The mayor's office released a statement. Its words carefully polished to suggest neutrality while hinting at doubt. We are committed to ensuring a fair and just process for all parties involved. The governor, meanwhile, remained silent, a silence that spoke louder than any speech. Ayanna wasn't fooled. This wasn't about saving Bryant, it was about punishing her for daring to challenge the unspoken rules. He might be the one in handcuffs, but the real war was just beginning, and it wasn't about guilt or innocence anymore, it was about power, raw and unyielding. She sat at her desk. Her fingers steepled, her mind racing through a labyrinth of possibilities. Every outcome, every countermove, every snare they might set, she turned them over like stones, searching for the cracks. A sharp knock broke her focus. She lifted her gaze as her assistant, Tara, slipped inside. The young woman's face was pale, her wide eyes brimming with something that looked perilously close to dread. "There's someone here to see you," Tara said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ayanna's spine straightened. "Who?" A pause stretched between them, heavy and taut, before Tara answered softly. "The district attorney." Ayanna exhaled slowly, setting down the pen she hadn't realized she'd been clutching so tightly her knuckles had whitened. It was beginning. She rose. Smoothing the folds of her robe, her face settling into a mask of calm resolve. Without a word, she stepped out of her office and into the storm brewing beyond her door. The district attorney, Richard Voss, waited in the conference room, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his expression a blank slate. He was a man of politics first, justice a distant second, every gesture, every syllable crafted for the cameras and the voters. Today, he wasn't here as a friend. "Ayanna," he greeted, his voice clipped and cool, a thin veneer of professionalism over a core of steel. "We have a problem." She didn't sit. Instead, she stood tall, her gaze unwavering. "No," she corrected, her tone steady as granite. "Bryant has a problem. I upheld the law. If that's inconvenient for some people, that's not my burden to carry." A muscle twitched in Voss's jaw, a faint crack in his composure. "This is bigger than him now," he said, leaning forward slightly. "Do you see what's happening? The department's closing ranks. They're already rewriting the narrative. The police union's threatening a walkout if this isn't handled appropriately." His voice dipped, a warning laced into the words. "And there are people in this building who don't like the idea of a judge picking a fight with law enforcement." She didn't flinch. "I'm not fighting law enforcement," she said, each word deliberate. "I'm holding a criminal accountable. There's a difference." Silence hung between them, thick and electric. Then Voss sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose as if warding off a headache. "They're coming for you," he admitted at last, his tone grudging. "They want to push for your recusal. If they can sow enough doubt, if they can make this look personal, they'll force you off the case." So that was their gambit. If they couldn't erase Bryant's sins, they'd erase her instead. She let the realization settle, feeling its weight press against her ribs. Then, slowly, a smile curved her lips, not warm, not kind, but sharp with certainty. "I'm not stepping down," she said simply. Voss's eyes hardened. "You might not have a choice." She sat then, folding her hands on the table, her posture unshaken. "Let them come." His jaw clenched, frustration flickering across his face. "This isn't a game, Ayanna." She met his stare, unflinching. "No," she replied, her voice low and resolute. "It's a reckoning." Another silence stretched, heavy with unspoken stakes. Finally, he stood, his movements stiff. "I'll do what I can," he said. His tone softer now, almost reluctant. "But you need to watch your back." She watched him leave, the door clicking shut behind him with a finality that echoed in the room. For the first time, She let herself feel it, not fear, not doubt, but a fierce, unshakable conviction. The system had spent decades shielding men like Bryant, burying their abuses under layers of bureaucracy and silence. Now, it was being dragged into the light, and if they thought they could break her, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. The courthouse corridors grew quieter as the day waned. But the stillness was a lie. Beyond those walls, the world burned, split between those who cheered Bryant's fall and those who saw it as an assault on their sacred order. Ayanna's office felt smaller now, the late afternoon light slanting through the blinds in sharp, elongated shadows. Her phone buzzed incessantly. A chorus of warnings and pleas from allies too timid to stand with her. She left it untouched. She already knew what they'd say. Then came another knock, softer this time. She rubbed her temples. Exhaustion tugging at her edges, before calling out, "Come in." The door creaked open, and to her surprise, it wasn't another suit-clad official. It was Detective Marcus Hale, a tall, broad-shouldered black man with gray threading through his close-cropped hair. He'd been a fixture in her courtroom for years, a steady presence who carried himself with quiet dignity. Unlike Bryant, Marcus never acted as though the law bent to his will. He stood in the doorway, his dark eyes meeting hers with a mix of respect and something heavier, concern, perhaps. "Judge Williams," he began, his voice deep and measured. "I thought you should know, there's talk on the force. Not everyone's with the union on this. Some of us, we saw what Bryant did. We know why you acted." She leaned back in her chair, studying him. "And yet here you are, risking your neck to tell me." He gave a faint, weary smile. "I've been on this job 20 years. Seen a lot of good cops, and a lot of bad ones. Bryant was the latter. The system's messy, but it's not blind. Not yet." His words hung there, a fragile thread of hope in the chaos. Ayanna nodded slowly, the weight of the day easing just a fraction. Outside, the storm raged on, but in that moment, she wasn't alone. Justice might be a brutal, imperfect thing, but it was worth fighting for. And she would. The air in the room hung heavy as Marcus lingered at the threshold, his silhouette framed by the dim light spilling in from the hallway. His brow furrowed, a storm of indecision swirling in his dark eyes. Ayanna, seated behind her desk, gave a subtle nod toward the chair across from her. An unspoken invitation laced with quiet authority. For a heartbeat, he wavered, his hand resting on the doorframe as if it were the last tether to retreat. Then, with a reluctant sigh, he crossed the boundary, the door clicking shut behind him like a gavel striking wood. Silence stretched between them, thick and deliberate. Marcus didn't speak at first, instead, he stood there. His gaze tracing her features, searching, perhaps, for a crack in her resolve, a hint of doubt he could cling to. Finding none, he exhaled, a slow, weary sound that seemed to carry the weight of decades, and lowered himself into the chair. "They're not letting this go," he said at last, his voice a low rumble, roughened by years of swallowed truths. His fingers twitched against the armrest, betraying the calm he tried to project. Ayanna leaned back, the leather of her chair creaking faintly under her shifting weight. "I know," she replied, her tone steady, unshaken. She'd known the moment she'd ruled against Bryant that the ripples would turn into a tidal wave. She'd braced for it, but knowing didn't soften the blow. Marcus dragged a hand across his face. The lines etched their deepening as he wrestled with what he'd come to say. "You don't get it, Ayanna. Bryant isn't just some cop who stepped out of line. He's one of them, crafted in their mold, shielded by their hands. And you? You didn't just break him. You broke their mirror." His words hung in the air, sharp and jagged, cutting through the stillness. He wasn't accusing her, not exactly. But there was a heaviness in his voice, a warning born from years of watching the system chew up those who dared to defy it. Her fingers began a slow, rhythmic tap against the polished wood of her desk, a habit she'd picked up in moments of deep thought, or simmering fury. "So, Marcus," she said, her voice cool but edged with steel. "Are you here to caution me, or are you here to tell me to fold?" Her eyes locked onto his, unflinching, daring him to choose a side. He met her stare, unflinching in return. Though something flickered in his expression, regret, maybe, or exhaustion. "I'm here to tell you I've been in this game for 22 years. I've seen how the machine works, Ayanna. Out front. They'll disown him, cut him loose for the cameras, make all the right noises about accountability. But behind closed doors? They're already laying the groundwork to bury this. To bury you." His jaw tightened, a muscle ticking beneath the stubble. "They'll make an example out of you, turn you into the problem so no one looks too hard at the rot underneath." Ayanna's eyes narrowed, her breath escaping in a slow, deliberate stream. She wasn't naive, she'd known they'd come for her, known the moment she'd signed her name to that ruling that the system would bare its teeth. "And what's next, then?" she asked, her voice low, probing. Marcus shook his head, his lips pressing into a thin, grim line. "They're pushing for internal reviews, digging into every case you've ever touched, every decision you've made about one of their own. They're hunting for dirt. Anything they can twist to paint you as reckless, biased, unfit. And that's not all." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping even lower, as if the walls themselves might be listening. "They're already working the jury pool." Her spine stiffened, a jolt of disbelief cutting through her carefully maintained composure. "The jury hasn't even been chosen yet," she said. The words sharp, incredulous. "Exactly." Marcus's eyes glinted with something dark, anger, maybe, or resignation. "They're making calls, pulling strings, having hushed little chats in back rooms. They want a panel that'll see Bryant as the tragic hero, the good man who stumbled, not the monster you proved he is." He paused, letting the weight of it settle, watching her reaction. Fury ignited in her chest, a hot, coiling thing she fought to keep leashed. Her face remained a mask of calm, but inside, her heart thundered against her ribs. "So they're stacking the deck again," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, each word dripping with contempt. "Rigging it to save him, just like always." Marcus nodded, a single, curt motion. "Yeah. They're not just protecting him, Ayanna. They're protecting the whole damn house of cards. If he goes down, really goes down, it's not just his badge on the line. It's theirs. It's the lie they've all been living. And they'll do anything to keep that illusion intact." She let the truth of it sink in, feeling it press against her like a physical weight, threatening to crush her resolve. The system wasn't just flawed, it was a living thing, twisting and bending to shield its own, no matter the cost. Bryant wasn't the exception, he was the rule. And now, because she'd dared to expose that, they were coming for her with everything they had. She drew a slow breath, steadying herself, and fixed Marcus with a level gaze. "Why tell me this? Why now?" He held her stare for a long, heavy moment, the silence stretching taut between them. Then he sighed, a sound so weary it seemed to age him a decade in an instant. "Because I'm tired," he admitted, his voice softening, cracking at the edges. "Tired of seeing good people get ground into dust so the bad ones can keep their thrones. Tired of pretending I don't see the blood on the walls. Maybe I should have spoken up years ago, fought harder when I still had the fire for it. But I didn't. I can't undo that. What I can do is make damn sure you know what's headed your way." Ayanna studied him, her mind racing. There was sincerity in his words. A rawness she hadn't expected from a man who'd worn the badge for over 2 decades. But beneath it, she saw the cracks, Marcus was a good man, yes, but he was still part of the machine. When push came to shove, would he stand with her, or would he fall back into line? She nodded, a small, measured gesture. "Thank you," she said simply, though the words felt hollow. He let out a short, bitter scoff. "Don't thank me yet. I can't stop this train. Hell, I can't even slow it down. All I've got is this, a heads up. The rest is on you." He rose from the chair. His movement stiff, as if the weight of his confession had settled into his bones. Then he was gone, the door clicking shut behind him, leaving her alone with the storm he'd unleashed. The next 2 days unraveled like a fever dream, a relentless whirlwind of tension that left her nerves frayed and raw. The DA's office kept their distance, tiptoeing around her case with practiced caution, unwilling to taint their pristine image by standing too close. The governor, ever the politician, finally released a statement, a vague, spineless platitude about faith in the judicial process that said nothing and meant less. Meanwhile, the police department doubled down, their PR machine whirring to life. Leaks flooded the press, painting Bryant as a dedicated officer who'd had one bad day, a flawed but noble soul undone by a single misstep. Ayanna, on the other hand, became the villain du jour. Some outlets branded her overzealous, others whispered about her volatile temperament. Then came the threats, anonymous emails that glowed ominously on her screen. Voicemails left in the dead of night, messages scrawled in venomous shorthand, all urging her to back off before it was too late. Fear didn't touch her, not yet. Instead, each new assault stoked the fire in her gut, turning anger into something molten, unstoppable. But the real shift, the moment she knew this fight had metastasized into something far larger, came late one night as she left the courthouse. Exhaustion clung to her like damp cloth, her mind buzzing with 1,000 contingencies, 1,000 moves and countermoves. Her heels clicked against the pavement of the parking lot, the sound echoing in the stillness, swallowed by the shadows cast by flickering streetlights. Then she felt it, a prickle at the nape of her neck, that ancient instinct that screams you're not alone. She slowed her pace, her eyes sweeping the darkness, every sense sharpened to a razor's edge. There, just across the street, a black sedan idled, its driver's window cracked open, the faint ember of a cigarette glowing like a predator's eye in the gloom. Watching. Waiting. She didn't flinch. Didn't let her steps falter. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. With deliberate calm, she unlocked her car, slid into the driver's seat, and pulled away. The sedan's presence lingering in her rearview mirror like a ghost. But the message was unmistakable, this wasn't just about her career anymore. They were probing her limits, testing how far she'd push before she broke. Her hands tightened around the steering wheel, knuckles widening as resolve hardened in her chest. She'd spent her life chasing justice, not the hollow, performative kind, but the real thing, the kind that left scars. Now, she was fighting for something greater, for every voice silenced, every truth buried, every soul told to bow to the machine. If they thought fear would bend her, they were about to learn how fiercely she'd stand. Inside the courthouse, the world felt muted. The city's hum reduced to a distant drone by the thick stone walls. But within her office, the tension was a living thing, coiling around her as she sat at her desk, surrounded by a sea of documents. Case files, motions, smear campaigns, all of it meticulously designed to unmake her, lay sprawled before her, their weight pressing down like a physical force. She refused to let it show. Refused to let her shoulders slump or her gaze waver. The press had turned into a feeding frenzy, some hailed her as a crusader, others sneered at her as a judge undone by her own passion. Whispers grew louder, insidious and pervasive. This wasn't about Bryant anymore, they said. It was about power, about the system flexing its muscles to remind her, and everyone else, who held the reins. A sharp knock broke the silence, precise and commanding. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. Thomas Grayson's presence carried a weight all its own. A blend of arrogance and calculation that preceded him. "Come in," she called, her voice a controlled thread of steel. The door swung open, and there he stood, the district attorney. Clad in a suit so pristine it screamed privilege, his expression a carefully sculpted mask of neutrality. He closed the door with a measured slowness, as if savoring the moment, then crossed the room, adjusting his cufflinks with a practiced flick of his wrists. "You know why I'm here," he said, his tone smooth, almost genial, though it carried an undercurrent of warning. Ayanna leaned back, folding her arms across her chest. "Let me take a wild guess. The mayor's office wants to wash their hands of this mess, and you're here to nudge me into making it easy for them." Grayson sighed. A theatrical little sound, and adjusted his stance. "This isn't personal, Ayanna." She let out a short, biting laugh, the sound cutting through the room like a blade. "That's the thing, Thomas. It's always personal when it's someone like me, someone who doesn't fit their neat little picture." Her words landed hard, and she saw the faintest tightening in his jaw. A crack in his polished facade. He didn't argue, couldn't, really, because they both knew she was right. "You're being boxed in," he pressed on, stepping closer, his voice lowering as if sharing a confidence. "I'm here to offer you a way out before this spirals any further." He slid a crisp, neatly typed document across her desk, his fingers lingering on it for a moment. "This is a statement. You step back from Bryant's case, voluntarily. Say you've reconsidered, that you want to ensure impartiality. It's clean, it's graceful. And it keeps you in the game." She tilted her head, her eyes narrowing as she studied him, then the paper, then him again. The offer hung there, tempting in its simplicity, but laced with poison. To take it would be to admit defeat, to let them win, not just over her, but over every principle she'd ever fought for. Grayson watched her, his gaze steady, waiting for her to bend. But bending wasn't in her blood. Justice, she thought, wasn't a gift handed down from on high, it was a battle, bloody and brutal, waged against those who'd twist it to serve themselves. Bryant's fall had exposed their hypocrisy, and now they were scrambling to punish her for it, to teach the world that power protects its own. Marcus's warning, Grayson's offer. The threats in the dark, they were all threads in the same tapestry, woven to preserve a lie. But she wouldn't unravel. Not now, not ever. She pushed the document back toward Grayson, her voice quiet but unyielding. "I'll take my chances." The room was suffocatingly quiet, save for the faint rustle of paper as Ayanna's eyes skimmed the document in front of her. Each word seemed to coil and twist, sharp-edged and venomous, like a snake poised to strike. She murmured a soft, "I see," her voice barely above a whisper, as she lifted her gaze to meet Grayson's. Her dark eyes burned with a quiet intensity, a storm brewing beneath the calm surface. Grayson, perched across from her, faltered for a heartbeat. His fingers twitched against the armrest, betraying the unease he tried so hard to mask. "They let this go," he said at last, his tone measured but heavy, as if the words carried the weight of a crumbling empire. "The pressure fades. The headlines move on, and you walk away with everything still intact." Ayanna didn't respond immediately. She studied him, her head tilting ever so slightly, as though peering through the layers of his polished exterior to the raw, uncertain man beneath. Her silence stretched, thick and deliberate, until she reached for the document. Grayson's shoulders loosened for a fleeting moment, a flicker of relief crossing his face, until her hands gripped the paper and tore it clean in two. The sound of ripping fibers sliced through the stillness, sharp and final. Grayson flinched, a subtle jerk of his frame, before his expression hardened into something cold and unyielding. "You really want to fight this?" he asked, his voice low, edged with a warning she refused to heed. Ian didn't blink. She met his stare head-on, her own voice steady as steel. "I'm not the one fighting," she said, each syllable deliberate, resonant. "They are." Grayson exhaled sharply through his nose, a sound of exasperation, and dragged his hands across his temples as if he could rub away the tension mounting between them. "You're making a mistake, Ian," he muttered, his tone dipping into something almost pleading. She rose then, pressing her palms flat against the desk, the cool wood grounding her as she leaned forward. "No, Thomas," she replied, her voice dropping to a fierce, unshakable whisper. "The mistake was thinking I'd back down." Grayson's jaw tightened, his fingers curling into half-fists as he studied her. The air between them crackled with unspoken stakes. "They're not just coming for your job," he said finally, his words slow and deliberate, each one landing like a stone. "They're coming for your career, your reputation, everything you've built." Ian's lips parted, a faint breath escaping her, and then, slowly, a smile curved her mouth. It was a small, dangerous thing, sharp as a blade. "Good," she said, her voice steady and clear. "That means they're scared." Grayson shook his head, his patience splintering like cracked glass. "What, you want to be a martyr? Is that it?" Her eyes narrowed, glinting with resolve. "I want to be something they can't erase." The silence that followed was heavy, oppressive, a living thing pressing against them both. Grayson sighed, a sound laced with resignation. "You always were a stubborn one," he said, his voice softer now, tinged with something that might have been regret. Ian's smile returned, but it was devoid of warmth, a mere ghost of amusement. "That's why I'm still here," she replied. He lingered for a moment longer, his expression a tangled mess of frustration and something unreadable, admiration, perhaps, or pity. Then, without another word, he turned and strode out, the door clicking shut behind him with a sound that echoed like a gavel. Ian sank back into her chair, her pulse racing. Adrenaline surging through her veins like wildfire. She had made her choice, and there was no retreat now, no path back to the safety of compromise. That night, sleep eluded her. She lay in the dark. Her mind a whirlwind of possibilities, every trap they might set, every lie they might spin, every way they could twist this to shield Jonathan Bryant, the man at the center of it all. The clock ticked relentlessly forward, each second amplifying her restlessness, until at exactly 2:34 a.m., her phone buzzed against the nightstand. She frowned, her heart lurching as she reached for it. A single message glowed on the screen, from a blocked number: "Check your front porch." A chill slithered down her spine, cold and insistent. She slid out of bed, her bare feet brushing the hardwood floor as she moved with cautious precision toward the window. Peeling back the curtain just enough to peek outside, she froze. There, on the steps, bathed in the faint, flickering glow of the streetlight, sat a thick manila envelope. Her stomach churned, a knot of dread tightening within her. She hesitated, her breath shallow. Then grabbed a hoodie from the chair, pulling it over her shoulders as she descended the stairs. The night air greeted her with an eerie stillness, the world beyond her door too quiet, too empty. She retrieved the envelope, her eyes darting to the shadows one last time before she retreated inside, locking the door with a trembling hand. In the dim light of her kitchen, she tore open the flap. Her fingers tense and unsteady. A file spilled out, a dense, heavily redacted police report. At the top, a name: Jonathan Bryant. Her breath hitched, her pulse hammering as she scanned the pages. With each line, her heartbeat grew louder, a relentless drum in her chest. Complaints buried deep, reports of excessive force, fabricated evidence, brutality, all of it laid bare. And then, on the final page, unredacted and stark, a name she knew too well: her father. The world tilted beneath her. When she was 12, her father had been accused of theft. A charge she'd spent years convincing herself was a mistake, a cruel twist of a broken system. But now, here was the truth, cold and undeniable. Bryant had been there, had orchestrated it. Had ruined her family with the same untouchable arrogance he'd wielded his entire career. She gripped the papers until her knuckles whitened, her hands trembling not with fear but with a raw, consuming rage. This wasn't just about justice anymore, it was personal, a wound reopened and festering. If they thought she was a threat before, they were about to discover the full measure of her fury. Days later, the courtroom buzzed with restless energy, packed beyond capacity. Every seat was claimed. Every inch along the walls crowded with reporters scribbling furiously, legal analysts whispering predictions, and ordinary people who'd clawed their way in to witness history unfold. The air was thick with anticipation, a palpable weight that pressed against every chest, every nerve. It felt electric, like the charged stillness before a thunderstorm splits the sky. This wasn't just a trial, it was a reckoning, a moment where the scales of justice might finally tip. Ian sat at the bench, her hands steady on the polished wood. Her face a mask of composure honed by years in rooms like this. She'd listened to countless testimonies, sifted through mountains of evidence, sought truth in the chaos of human conflict. But today was different. Today, it wasn't just about one man's guilt, it was about dismantling the system that had shielded him, about proving that even men like Jonathan Bryant weren't above the law. Across the room, Bryant sat rigid at the defendant's table, his once impeccable posture sagging under an invisible burden. His hands, clenched into tight fists on his lap, betrayed the cracks in his armor. The arrogance that had defined him, his shield, his weapon, was fraying. His face was pale, his jaw locked. His eyes flickering toward the jury as if he could bend their will with a glance. But the truth was inescapable, he'd lost the power he'd clutched for decades. The ability to dictate who fell and who stood. Now, he was just another man, stripped bare before the law. The jury had deliberated for 5 grueling hours, each minute stretching into eternity. Then, at precisely 3:47 p.m., they filed back in, their faces carefully neutral but their eyes heavy with the weight of their decision. A murmur rippled through the crowd. A wave of held breaths and shifting bodies. The room fell silent, so still that the rustle of paper, the creak of a chair, even a stifled cough felt like a thunderclap. The foreman rose, unfolding the verdict with steady hands, his expression inscrutable. He cleared his throat, casting a fleeting glance at Bryant before speaking. In that suspended moment, time itself seemed to halt. The world poised on a razor's edge. We, the jury, find the defendant, Jonathan Bryant, guilty on all counts. The words detonated through the room. A collective gasp swept the crowd, followed by a surge of raw emotion, whispers, sobs, exhaled relief from those who'd waited years for this. But Bryant didn't move. For several agonizing seconds, he sat frozen, his face blank. His hands still, his body rejecting the reality crashing down around him. Then his breathing shifted, sharp, uneven, his shoulders rising and falling as his nostrils flared. His jaw clenched so tightly it seemed he might shatter his own teeth, a desperate attempt to hold himself together as the world he'd built unraveled. The chief bailiff stepped forward, his voice firm. "Jonathan Bryant, please rise." Bryant didn't budge, as if his mind clung to some delusion of reprieve. Then, slowly, like a condemned man trudging toward the gallows, he stood. His hands, once symbols of his authority, gripping his badge, his gun, his power, hung limp at his sides, useless now. In that courtroom, justice wasn't just served, it was reclaimed. Ian watched. Her heart steady, her resolve unbreakable. Bryant's fall wasn't merely punishment, it was a lesson etched in the bones of the system he'd abused. Power unchecked breeds corruption, and no one, not even the untouchable, escapes the consequences forever. On a crisp March morning in 2025, the courtroom buzzed with a tense, electric anticipation as Jonathan Bryant stood motionless. His broad shoulders slumped under the weight of inevitability. The judge's voice rang out, clear and unwavering, delivering a sentence that echoed through the chamber like a thunderclap. 15 years, no chance of parole for the first decade, no special privileges, no loopholes to exploit. For the first time in his life, Jonathan, a man who had thrived on bending the world to his will, felt the suffocating grip of powerlessness close around him. His chest tightened as the reality sank in, there would be no escaping this. The bailiff stepped forward, his heavy boots thudding against the polished floor, and Jonathan flinched as the cold, unyielding metal of handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists. The very tool he had once wielded to dominate and terrorize others now bound him, its icy bite a cruel mirror of his past actions. His breath hitched, shallow and uneven, as he stood rooted to the spot, a prisoner of his own making. Across the room, Ayanna sat in the gallery, her dark eyes fixed on him with a quiet intensity. She didn't blink as the cuffs clicked into place, her heart pounding with a mix of relief and lingering rage. She had waited years for this moment. Years of watching him strut through life untouchable, his arrogance a shield no one dared pierce. Now, as the cameras flashed like lightning, capturing every twitch of his clenched jaw and every flicker of dread in his hazel eyes, she saw the mask slip. He turned his head, just a fraction, and their gazes locked for a fleeting second. In that instant, she glimpsed the raw, unfiltered truth. He knew he was finished. The power he had clung to, the power he had used to crush others, was gone. Stripped away by the very system he thought he owned. Ayanna's lips pressed into a thin line, her hands trembling slightly in her lap as the gavel crashed down with finality. A sound that reverberated in her bones. Justice, she thought, tasted bittersweet. As the bailiff escorted Bryant toward the side exit, his once confident stride reduced to a shuffling gait. The courtroom seemed to exhale. The man who had loomed larger than life, a predator cloaked in a badge, vanished from view, swallowed by the shadows of his own reckoning. Outside, the world waited with bated breath. The moment Ayanna emerged onto the courthouse steps, the crisp spring air hit her face, sharp and invigorating. But it was drowned out by the chaos that erupted around her. Reporters swarmed like bees, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of shouted questions. How do you feel? Was it worth the fight? Protesters and supporters clashed in a sea of signs and chants, their fervor spilling onto the street where news vans stood parked, their antennas piercing the sky. Cameras pivoted toward her, lenses glinting in the sunlight, and Ayanna stood tall, her chin lifted despite the weight of exhaustion pulling at her. She didn't need to speak, the verdict had roared loud enough. The nation had watched, riveted, as this trial unfolded, a test of whether justice could truly prevail against a man who had mocked it for years. But this wasn't just about Jonathan Bryant. It wasn't just about one corrupt officer finally facing the music. It was about the rotting core of a system that had cradled him, nurtured his impunity, and turned a blind eye to the wreckage he left behind. How many complaints had been buried in dusty files? How many victims had choked on their silenced screams? How many times had he swaggered away, unscathed, because the rules were sculpted to protect men like him? Bryant hadn't just believed he was invincible, he had been molded into that belief. Handed a license to abuse by those too cowardly or complicit to stop him. Ayanna's mind churned with these thoughts as she descended the steps, the crowd parting around her like a river. Power, she realized, was a fragile illusion, sustained only as long as the powerless stayed quiet. But when the brave rose up, when voices refused to be muffled, even the mightiest could crumble. Yet a shadow lingered in her triumph. How many more Bryants still roamed free, their hands stained with the same arrogance, their boots still trampling the vulnerable? Meanwhile, on a bitter winter night in Chicago, miles away from the courthouse's marble halls. Another story was unfolding, one that spoke to the quiet heroism born of compassion rather than the loud reckoning of justice. Officer Michael Torres trudged through the deserted streets, the wind howling like a wounded animal as it sliced through his thick coat. It was the dead of winter, the kind of cold that gnawed at your bones and made every breath sting. He had just finished a grueling shift at the precinct, his mind a tangle of paperwork and petty arrests, and decided to walk home through the city's ghostly quiet. The street stretched out before him, empty save for the faint glow of streetlights flickering on wet pavement, casting long, jagged shadows that danced in the wind. His hands were stuffed deep in his pockets, his shoulders hunched against the chill, when a faint rustling broke through the silence, a sound so soft he almost dismissed it as the wind playing tricks. But then came another noise, one that stopped him cold, the muffled sob of a child. A shiver ran down his spine, not from the weather but from a sudden, visceral dread. Who could be out here? In this forsaken alley, at this hour? His cop instincts kicked in, urging him forward despite the exhaustion tugging at his limbs. The deeper he ventured into the narrow passage, the dimmer the streetlights grew, until the darkness seemed to press against him, thick and oppressive. Then, beneath a weak pool of yellow light, he saw them. Two small figures huddled beside a rusted trash can. Twin girls, no more than 5 or 6, their frail bodies trembling in the frigid air. The older one, her bony frame bent over the garbage, sifted through the refuse with desperate precision, while the younger stood a step back, clutching a tattered cloak to her chest, her wide eyes darting like a cornered animal's. Their clothes hung off them in filthy rags, their bare feet swollen and crimson from the cold, their curly hair matted into greasy knots. Michael's heart lurched, a tight knot forming in his throat. He had seen plenty in his years on the force, violence, despair, neglect, but this was different. These girls were so thin their cheekbones jutted sharply against their skin. Their faces hollowed by hunger, their eyes dulled by a weariness no child should know. The older one held up a crust of moldy bread, sniffing it with a cautious hope that broke his heart. He stood frozen, afraid to move too quickly and spook them, his mind racing with questions. How long had they been out here? Where were their parents? How had the world let them slip through its cracks? Slowly, he lowered himself to one knee, his voice soft as a whisper against the wind. Hey, kids, I'm a police officer. You don't have to be scared. I just want to help. The older girl, Leah, he'd later learn, jerked upright, yanking her sister back with a protective fierceness. Stay away. We don't want trouble, she cried. Her voice quivering but defiant, her small fists balled at her sides. Her sister, Lila, peeked out from behind her, her round face streaked with dirt and tears. Michael raised his hands, palms open, his expression gentle despite the ache in his chest. I'm not here to hurt you. You're hungry, right? I've got something for you. With deliberate care, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a granola bar, a habit from long shifts, and set it on the ground between them. He stepped back, giving them space, watching as Leah hesitated, her sharp gaze flicking between him and the food. Lila whispered something too faint to hear, and after a long, tense moment, Leah edged forward, snatching the bar with trembling hands. She didn't eat it herself. She tore it open and pressed it into Lila's grasp, who devoured a piece with a hunger that bordered on feral. Leah's eyes stayed on Michael, still wary but softening at the edges. I can take you somewhere safe, he said, kneeling again to meet her at eye level. A place where you won't be cold or hungry anymore. Leah's brow furrowed, suspicion warring with a fragile hope. Where? She asked, her voice barely above a breath. Somewhere warm, he promised, his own resolve hardening. Somewhere you'll be taken care of. In that moment, Michael felt the weight of a choice he hadn't anticipated, a choice that would pull him into a battle against prejudice, strain his engagement to his fiancée, and test every ounce of his strength. But as he looked into their haunted eyes, he knew he couldn't walk away. This was more than a chance encounter. It was the beginning of a journey that would transform him into the reluctant father these forgotten girls needed, a journey that would ripple through their lives and his, proving that even in the darkest corners, compassion could light a path forward. Back at the courthouse, Ayana's victory underscored a deeper lesson: justice, when it strikes, is a merciless teacher. Bryant's fall was a testament to the consequences of unchecked power, a warning etched in the cold steel of his cuffs and the final thud of the gavel. Yet Michael's story whispered a quieter truth. That justice alone isn't enough. It takes courage, messy, human courage, to confront the systems that fail the innocent, whether through corruption or neglect. Together, their tales wove a tapestry of accountability and redemption, reminding us that while one battle may end, the war for a world where power serves rather than destroys rages on. In the dim glow of a Chicago alley, a soft voice broke the silence, fragile yet piercing, as Lila murmured, almost too quiet to hear, "We don't want to go back to the orphanage." Her words landed like a dagger in Michael's chest, sharp and unrelenting. He didn't know the full weight of their past, but the tremor in her voice painted a vivid picture of fear, of wounds too deep for children so small. Without a second thought, he reached for his radio, summoning an ambulance with a steady urgency that belied the storm brewing inside him. As they waited, the biting wind clawing at their skin, he ushered the two girls, Leah and Lila, into the warmth of his patrol car. He shrugged off his heavy coat, draping it over their trembling shoulders. Leah, the older of the two, peered up at him, her voice a faint thread in the air. "Thank you, officer," she whispered, her eyes wide and searching. Michael's lips curved into a smile, but beneath it surged something unfamiliar, a fierce, protective instinct that gripped his heart and wouldn't let go. The ambulance arrived with a wail of sirens, cutting through the stillness of the night. Michael climbed in beside the girls, settling into the narrow space between them as the vehicle lurched forward. He took Leah's hand, her fingers icy and frail against his own, and leaned close. "I won't let anyone hurt you anymore," he whispered, his voice a solemn vow. "I promise." Neither girl spoke, but their eyes, Leah's cautious, Lila's clinging to a flicker of hope, locked onto his, tethering them together in that fleeting moment. The ambulance raced through Chicago's deserted streets, its red and blue lights slashing across the darkened buildings like a beacon in the void. Leah pressed herself against the window, clutching the coat tighter, while Lila curled into Michael's side, her tiny hands gripping his sleeve as if he were the last anchor in a world that had crumbled beneath her. Inside, Michael's mind churned. This wasn't just another call, another night on duty to clock out of. No, this was something seismic, a shift he felt in his bones. He glanced at Leah, her sharp cheekbones stark against her pale skin, and then at Lila, her breaths shallow but steady. He couldn't shake the image of them scrounging by that trash can, ghostly figures in the shadows, scavenging for scraps to survive. When they reached the hospital, the doors burst open, and the medical team swept in with practiced efficiency. Michael trailed close behind as the girls were whisked into the emergency room, his boots echoing on the linoleum floor, his gaze never straying from them. The sterile scent of antiseptics stung his nose, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the walls. A doctor approached, clipboard in hand, his expression a mix of gravity and compassion. "They're in rough shape," he said, his voice low but firm. "The older one, severely malnourished and dehydrated. The younger one's not much better, and she's got some scratches and bruises, likely from rough living." Michael's jaw tightened, but he forced his tone to stay even. "They'll pull through, right?" The doctor's eyes softened. "We'll do everything we can. You got them here just in time, any longer, and I can't say what might have happened." The words hung heavy, sinking into Michael like lead. He nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat, and turned to peer through the glass into the examination room. Leah sat upright on a bed, her posture rigid, while Lila lay sprawled on another. Exhaustion claiming her. They looked so small, so breakable, dwarfed by the sterile white sheets and the flurry of nurses moving around them. A nurse waved him in, and he stepped into the room. His presence filling the space with a quiet strength. Leah's eyes tracked his every move, still guarded but softer now, as if his steady gaze chipped away at her defenses. He pulled a chair beside her bed, the metal legs scraping against the floor, and sat down. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his tone gentle but laced with concern. Leah stared at her hands, her fingers twisting together. "We're okay," she whispered, then hesitated. "It's just, we don't want to go back to the orphanage." Her voice cracked, and Michael felt it, a raw, aching plea that sliced through him. He drew a deep breath, steadying himself against the flood of emotion her words unleashed. "I promise," he said, his eyes burning with resolve. "I'll find you a safe place. No one will hurt you anymore." Leah lifted her gaze, her brown eyes shimmering with doubt and a fragile thread of hope. "You promise?" she asked, her voice trembling like a leaf in the wind. "I promise," he replied, unwavering, and though she said nothing more. The slight nod she gave him felt like the first crack of trust breaking through her armor. That night, Michael didn't leave. He stayed rooted by Leah's bedside, his broad frame slouched in the chair, watching over her as Lila slept soundly nearby. Leah didn't sleep, her eyes, wide and restless, stared at the ceiling, tracing invisible fears across its blank expanse. Michael leaned closer, his voice a soft murmur in the quiet. "Are you okay, Leah?" She shook her head, her whisper barely audible. We don't want to bother you. If you take us, we'll be good. We won't cause trouble." Her words stunned him, a gut punch that left him reeling. That she, so young, saw herself as a burden, it shattered something inside him. He reached for her hand, her cold, trembling fingers dwarfed by his warm grip. "Leah," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you and Lila aren't a burden. I want to help you because you deserve it. You're not troubling anyone." For the first time, tears welled in her eyes, silent streams carving paths down her gaunt cheeks. Michael brushed them away with a tenderness that surprised even him. A fierce determination igniting within him to shield these girls from a world that had already taken too much. All night, he kept vigil. Lila's steady breaths filled the silence, a small comfort. While Leah shifted restlessly, her tiny frame swallowed by the hospital bed. He didn't know what lay ahead, but one truth anchored him: his life had veered onto a new path, irrevocably altered by these two souls. Morning crept in, gray light filtering through the blinds, and when Leah's eyes fluttered open, they found Michael still there, his tired face softening into a gentle smile. For the first time, she smiled back, a faint, hesitant curve of her lips, but to Michael, it was a dawn breaking after an endless night. When he finally stepped outside, the cold March wind sliced through his jacket, but he barely felt it. His mind replayed every moment: Leah's wary gaze, Lila's clinging hands, the weight of their trust settling on his shoulders. He stopped at a coffee shop on his way home, a familiar haunt with chipped mugs and the hum of quiet conversations. Ordering a black coffee, he slid into a booth by the window, the steam rising from the cup warming his hands as he stared at the sparse traffic crawling by. But his thoughts were elsewhere, on Leah's quiet strength. How she shielded her sister with every glance, on Lila's timid hope, peeking out from behind her fear. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen before dialing Monica, his fiancée. She answered after a few rings, her voice bright and familiar, a lifeline in the chaos of his thoughts. They'd dreamed of a future together, marriage, a house, kids of their own, but now, two fragile girls had rewritten that script. He took a breath, knowing she'd listen, hoping she'd stand with him in this uncharted territory. In that alley, Michael had stumbled into more than a rescue. He'd uncovered a lesson etched in the girls' hollow eyes: justice wasn't just a badge or a courtroom verdict, it was a promise kept. A hand extended when power had failed them. The orphanage, the streets, the bruises on Lila's skin, they were scars of a system that had turned its back, of authority abused or absent. Now, with every fiber of his being, Michael vowed to be their shield, to wield his own power not as a weapon but as a refuge. The consequences of neglect had nearly claimed them. But he'd rewrite their story, one where trust could bloom, where the powerless found a voice, and where a single night in Chicago's shadows sparked a lifetime of redemption. The morning sun spilled through the cracked blinds of Michael's modest apartment, casting thin golden stripes across the hardwood floor. He sat slumped in an old armchair, the cushion sagging beneath his weight, his eyes tracing the patterns of light without truly seeing them. Exhaustion clung to him like a second skin after a sleepless night at the hospital. Yet his mind buzzed with restless energy. The phone rested heavily in his hand, still warm from the call he'd just ended with Monica. Her voice, drowsy at first, then sharp and frigid, echoed in his memory, each word a splinter lodged deep in his chest. "Michael, where are you? I thought you'd be home by last night," she'd mumbled, her tone thick with sleep and faint irritation. He could picture her sitting up in bed, rubbing her eyes, the blanket slipping off her shoulder as she waited for an explanation. And so, he'd given her one, his voice slow and deliberate, as if laying out the pieces of a fragile puzzle. He told her everything, how he'd been on his usual patrol. The city streets cloaked in the gray hush of pre-dawn, when he'd heard a faint whimper from an alley. How he'd found them, two small girls huddled inside a rusted trash can, their thin bodies shivering against the cold metal, their eyes wide with terror. Leah, the older one, had clutched her sister Lila so tightly that her knuckles turned white, as though she could shield her from the world's cruelty with sheer will alone. He'd described the drive to the hospital, the girls silent in the back seat of his cruiser, their ragged breaths filling the space where words should have been. He told Monica how he'd stayed by their bedsides all night, the sterile white walls of the pediatric ward glowing under fluorescent lights, the steady beep of monitors punctuating the stillness. Leah had whispered to him in broken fragments, stories of hunger, of hiding, of hands that hurt them when no one was looking. Lila, too young to form full sentences, had simply curled into his side, her tiny fingers gripping his sleeve as if he were her lifeline. Michael's heart had twisted with every word, every tear, a quiet rage simmering beneath his exhaustion. How could anyone abandon them? How could the world let them fall through the cracks? The line had gone quiet after he finished, the silence stretching taut between them like a wire ready to snap. He'd waited, his breath shallow, picturing Monica's face, her furrowed brow, her lips pressed into a thin line as she processed it all. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but laced with pain. "I know this hurts you, Michael. But you did the right thing. You took them to the hospital. The doctors and social workers, they'll take it from there." He'd leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes against the ache building behind them. She was right. In a way. The system was designed to step in, to patch up the broken and move them along. But deep inside, a restless fire burned, whispering that it wasn't enough, not for Leah, not for Lila, not for him. "Monica," he'd said, his voice dropping low, "I think I want to adopt them." The words had exploded into the stillness like a thunderclap, shattering the fragile peace of their conversation. He could almost hear her gasp, the sharp intake of breath as her mind reeled. "What did you just say?" she'd asked, her tone faltering. Lost somewhere between disbelief and dread. "I want to adopt Leah and Lila," he repeated, clearer this time, his resolve hardening like steel. "They have no one else. I can't let them go back to the streets or get swallowed up by some orphanage." The image of their faces, Leah's wary brown eyes, Lila's trembling lip, flashed in his mind, fueling his determination. He couldn't abandon them, not after seeing the fear etched into their fragile frames, not after feeling the weight of their trust settle onto his shoulders. Monica's response came like a winter wind. Cold and cutting. "Do you even know what you're saying, Michael? These are strangers, girls you met less than a day ago. We're not ready to be parents, let alone adopt. This is insane." Her words stung, but he pressed on, struggling to keep his voice steady. "I know it sounds crazy, Monica. I get that. But there's something about them, I feel connected to them. I can't explain it. But I know I have to do this." Her laugh sliced through the phone, sharp and brittle, devoid of warmth. "A connection, Michael? This isn't some feel-good movie. This is real life. Do you have any idea how complicated adoption is? How expensive? We've got plans, buying a house, getting married, starting our own family. Are you really willing to throw all that away for 2 kids you just met?" Her voice trembled with a mix of anger and fear, and Michael could picture her pacing their small living room. Her hands clenched into fists. He fell silent, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He understood her worries, how could he not? They'd spent countless nights dreaming of their future. Sketching out a life built on stability and love. But as he sat there, the memory of Leah's quiet courage and Lila's desperate grip flooded his senses, drowning out those plans. "I'm not throwing anything away, Monica," he said finally, his tone firm but gentle. "Leah and Lila have no one. They've been abandoned, hurt, left to fend for themselves. I can't turn my back on them, not when I know I can help." Her exhale crackled through the phone, sharp with frustration. "What about me, Michael? What about us? I didn't sign up for this. I don't want my life flipped upside down because you've decided to play the hero." Her accusation hit him like a punch, and he felt his composure fray. "This isn't impulsive, Monica," he snapped. His voice rising despite himself. "I can't sleep at night knowing I left them there, knowing I could have done something but didn't." Her reply came cold and precise, each syllable a blade. "I'm not sure I can be with someone who always puts others before us." The words pierced him, lodging deep in his chest, and the silence that followed was suffocating. He had no response. No way to bridge the chasm widening between them. Finally, she sighed, softer this time, almost defeated. "I need time, Michael. I'll call you later." The line went dead, leaving him alone with the hum of the empty apartment and the hollow ache in his heart. He stayed there for hours, the phone slipping from his hand to the floor. His mind a storm of doubt and conviction. Monica's anger lingered like a shadow, her fears echoing his own. What if he couldn't do this? What if he failed them all? But beneath the uncertainty, a quiet certainty pulsed. He couldn't abandon Leah and Lila, no matter what it cost him. Justice demanded more than dropping them off at a hospital and walking away. It demanded accountability. Not just for those who'd hurt them, but for those who had the power to help and chose not to. And he'd seen too much as a police officer, too many lives crushed by indifference. Too many innocents paying the price for others' abuse of power, to let these girls become another statistic. By afternoon, Michael found himself back at the hospital. His boots echoing against the linoleum as he approached their room. The air smelled of antiseptic and faint hope, a stark contrast to the grime of the alley where he'd found them. Inside, Leah and Lila sat cross-legged on the narrow bed, a threadbare teddy bear cradled between them. Nurse Carla, a stout woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, had given it to them earlier. Her voice gruff but warm as she'd said, "You girls hang on to this, okay? It's been waiting for someone special." Now, Leah's nimble fingers adjusted the bear's lopsided ear while Lila giggled softly. Her laughter a fragile melody in the sterile space. Leah's head snapped up as he entered, her gaze locking onto him with a mix of surprise and tentative trust. A small smile flickered across her face, lighting up her weary features. "You're back," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, tinged with relief that tugged at his heart. He pulled a chair close to the bed and sat, his broad frame dwarfing the flimsy metal frame. "I promised," he replied, meeting her eyes. "I'm not going anywhere." She studied him for a long moment. Her large brown eyes searching his face as if testing the truth of his words. Then, almost hesitantly, she asked, "Where will you take us?" Her voice was soft, like a leaf carried on a gentle wind. Fragile yet resolute. "If you take us, we won't bother you. We'll be good. I promise." Michael leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. His expression softening with a warmth he hadn't known he could feel. "You'll never bother me, Leah," he said, his voice steady and kind. "You deserve to be loved, to be safe. Both of you. I want you to know that." For the first time, a genuine smile broke across her face, small but radiant, and she nodded, a silent agreement sealing the bond forming between them. In that instant, Michael felt a surge of purpose stronger than anything he'd ever known. He would fight for them, against Monica's doubts, against the labyrinth of the legal system. Against anyone who dared stand in his way, because they deserved more than the scraps life had thrown them. Back at his apartment the next morning, sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Michael sat at his worn kitchen table, a steaming mug of coffee forgotten beside him as he hunched over his laptop. The screen glowed with adoption forms and legal guidelines, each page a daunting maze of requirements, financial statements, background checks, home visits, counseling sessions. His pen scratched across a notepad, jotting down every detail, proof of income, references, the psychological evaluation he'd need to pass. His job as a police officer loomed large in his mind. The long hours, the danger, the unpredictability, would they see it as a liability? He pushed the thought aside, his jaw tightening. He'd make it work. He had to. With a deep breath, he picked up the phone and dialed the social services office, his pulse quickening as the line rang. "This is Michael Thompson," he said when a woman answered, his voice deep and unwavering. "I'd like to start the process of adopting 2 little girls." The woman on the other end, Mrs. Peterson, she introduced herself, responded with a warmth that surprised him. "Thank you for reaching out, Mr. Thompson. I'm the caseworker assigned to your file. Can you come in tomorrow afternoon to discuss everything?" He agreed without hesitation, his heart thudding against his ribs. This was it, the first step on a road he knew would be steep and winding, but one he was ready to travel. The next day, he stepped into the social services office, a small, unassuming space tucked between a bakery and a thrift store. The walls were lined with faded photos of smiling children and families, their edges curling from years of humidity. Behind a cluttered desk sat Mrs. Peterson, a middle-aged woman with salt and pepper hair pulled into a loose bun and eyes that sparkled with both sharpness and compassion. She gestured to a chair across from her, her movements brisk but welcoming. "Mr. Thompson, please, have a seat." He lowered himself into the chair, feeling the vinyl creak beneath him. His hands clasped tightly in his lap. She studied him for a long moment, her gaze piercing yet not unkind, as if peeling back layers to see the man beneath the badge. "You understand that adoption isn't a simple choice, don't you?" she began, her voice steady. "Especially in your case, 2 girls, no prior connection, and a demanding job. It's a lifelong commitment. You'll need to prove you've got the resources, money, time, stability. There'll be counseling, assessments, scrutiny of your career. Police work isn't exactly a 9-to-5 gig. Have you thought this through? Michael met her eyes, unflinching. Yes, I have, he said, his tone resolute. I know it won't be easy. But Leah and Lila, they've got no one. I can't let them drift back into a system that's failed them already. I've seen what happens when power's abused, when people look the other way. I won't be one of them. His words carried the weight of every calloused hand he'd cuffed, every broken soul he'd failed to save, every lesson etched into his bones about justice and its price. Mrs. Peterson leaned back, her lips curving into a faint, approving smile. Well then, Mr. Thompson, she said, reaching for a stack of forms, let's get started. And as she began to outline the journey ahead, Michael felt the fire within him burn brighter. This wasn't just about saving two girls, it was about righting a wrong, about wielding the power he'd been given to protect rather than destroy. Whatever lay ahead, he'd face it head-on, because Leah and Lila deserved a future, and he'd tear down the world to give it to them. Michael stood in the sterile hospital hallway, his broad shoulders tense with resolve as he faced Mrs. Peterson, the social worker assigned to his case. His deep brown eyes flickered with a quiet fire, a mixture of exhaustion and unyielding determination. Leah and Lila, two fragile souls who had endured more than any child should, weighed heavily on his heart. He couldn't bear the thought of them suffering any longer, abandoned, neglected, their innocence chipped away by a world too cruel for their tender years. They've been through enough, he said, his voice steady but laced with an ache that betrayed his stoic exterior. I won't let them keep hurting. Mrs. Peterson, a woman in her late 40s with sharp features softened by years of compassion, nodded thoughtfully. Her pen scratched across the pages of her worn notebook, capturing Michael's words with careful precision. She adjusted her glasses, peering up at him with a look that was both encouraging and stern. All right, Michael, she began, her tone measured but warm. We'll start the assessment process immediately. It's a long road ahead, forms to fill out, interviews to sit through, home inspections to prepare for. And we'll need you to complete parenting classes. This won't be simple or quick, but if you're truly committed, we'll be here to guide you every step of the way. Michael's jaw tightened, and he gave a resolute nod. I'll do whatever it takes, he replied, his words carrying the weight of a vow. In the days that followed, he threw himself into the adoption process with a fervor that surprised even him. Mornings blurred into late nights as he hunched over his kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of paperwork. Each form felt like a brick in the foundation of the future he was building for Leah and Lila. He gathered documents, proof of income, references. A spotless background check, his hands trembling slightly as he signed his name, knowing each signature brought him closer to them. The interviews with social workers were grueling, their questions probing into every corner of his life. But every time he spoke of Leah and Lila, his voice softened, and his eyes shone with a fierce tenderness. He recounted the moment he'd first met them, their wary glances, their small hands clutching each other, and how, in that instant, an unspoken bond had taken root in his soul. One crisp afternoon, after a draining counseling session where he'd bared his fears and hopes to a therapist, Michael's phone buzzed in his pocket. He fumbled to answer it, his heart leaping as he recognized the hospital's number. On the other end was Carla, the nurse who had become a quiet guardian to Leah and Lila during their recovery. Her voice, usually calm and professional, carried an urgency that made Michael's chest tighten. Michael, the girls are doing so much better now, she said, pausing as if to steady herself. But this morning, Leah asked about you. She wanted to know if you were coming back. I think you should come as soon as you can." The words hit him like a punch, a bittersweet ache spreading through him. He barely mumbled a thank you before ending the call, his keys already in hand as he raced to his truck. The drive to the hospital was a blur of honking horns and red lights. His mind replaying Leah's question over and over. When he pushed open the door to their room, his breath caught. Leah sat cross-legged on her bed. Her thin arms wrapped around a teddy bear Carla had given her, its fur matted from her constant grip. Her dark eyes, wide and searching, lifted to meet his. And a flicker of light broke through their usual guarded haze. Lila, perched on the next bed, was doodling absent-mindedly with a colored pencil. Her tiny frame hunched as if shielding herself from the world. At the sight of Michael, her pencil paused, and she glanced up with a mixture of curiosity and cautious hope. "Uncle's back," Leah said. Her voice small but threaded with a fragile joy that pierced Michael's heart. He crossed the room in 2 strides, lowering himself beside her bed with a smile that felt both natural and hard-won. "I promised, didn't I?" he said gently, resting his elbows on his knees. "I'm not going anywhere." Leah studied him for a long moment, her gaze intense. As if she were peeling back layers to see the truth beneath his words. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she asked, "Do you really want to keep us, Uncle?" The question hung in the air. Raw and vulnerable, and Michael felt his throat tighten. He reached for her hand, his rough fingers enveloping her delicate ones, and met her eyes with unwavering certainty. "Yes, Leah. I want you and Lila to have a real family. And I'll fight tooth and nail to make that happen." Leah didn't respond right away. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she processed his words, but then, slowly, a smile, small but genuine, curved her mouth. It was the first time Michael had seen her face light up like that, and it fueled his resolve like nothing else. Lila, watching silently, clutched her pencil a little tighter, her own expression softening as she absorbed the moment. As the adoption process marched forward, Michael faced storms beyond the paperwork and interviews. Whispers began to swirl through the police station where he worked, their echoes reaching him like a bitter wind. One afternoon, as he stepped into the break room seeking a moment's respite, he overheard 2 colleagues, Daniel and Harris, muttering over their coffee. Daniel, a wiry man with a perpetual smirk, leaned against the counter. "I just don't get it," he said, his voice dripping with skepticism. "Why is he doing this? Adopting 2 kids in his position? He's only making life harder for himself." Harris, broader and gruffer, snorted in agreement. "And they're black girls, too. A white cop taking in black kids? Did he even think about what people will say?" Michael's blood ran cold, then hot, as he stepped fully into the room. His boots thudded against the linoleum, and the air grew thick with tension as the 2 men turned, startled. "You got a problem with me helping those girls?" he asked, his voice low and edged with steel, his gaze locking onto theirs like a predator sizing up prey. Daniel faltered, scratching the back of his head nervously. "No, man, I was just curious, you know. It's a big choice." Harris shifted uncomfortably, saying nothing. Michael straightened, his presence filling the room. "Yeah, it's tough," he said, each word deliberate. "But it's right. And I don't give a damn what anyone thinks. I'm not stopping for anybody." The encounter left a sour taste in his mouth, but it only steeled his resolve. Society's narrow-mindedness was a hurdle, not a wall. Every day, he returned to the hospital, bringing stories of the home he was crafting for Leah and Lila. He described the bunk bed he'd assembled late into the night, the shelves he'd stocked with books, the stuffed animals he'd picked out with care. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden streaks through the hospital window, he sat by Leah's bed. She reached for his hand. Her grip surprisingly strong for someone so small, and looked up at him with eyes full of trust. "You promised you wouldn't leave, right?" she asked, her voice trembling with the weight of 1,000 unspoken fears. Michael leaned down, his hand tightening around hers. "Never, Leah. I'll always be here." In that moment, he knew this fight wasn't just for them, it was for the family they'd become, a bond he couldn't imagine living without. 2 months into the process, a call from Mrs. Peterson changed everything. Her voice crackled through the phone, steady but tinged with excitement. "Michael, you've passed the initial approval. You can bring Leah and Lila home under temporary foster care. This is the last step before full adoption." Joy surged through him, tangled with a thread of nerves. His life was about to transform irrevocably. He wasn't just a man anymore, he was a father. But beneath the anxiety lay a certainty he'd carried since the beginning: this was his purpose. The day the girls were discharged dawned bright and crisp. Michael arrived at the hospital early. A bundle of balloons bobbing in his hand and 2 stuffed animals tucked under his arm, a floppy-eared dog for Leah, a plush bunny for Lila. Carla waited in the hallway. Her scrubs wrinkled from a long shift, her eyes glistening with a mix of pride and melancholy. "You did it, Michael," she said, her smile warm but wistful. "Those girls trust you more than anyone. You're going to be an amazing dad." Michael shook her hand, his voice catching. "Thank you, Carla. I'll make sure they're happy, I swear it." When Leah and Lila emerged from their room, Leah's hand gripped her sister's tightly, her steps tentative but her face brightening at the sight of him. Lila trailed slightly behind, her eyes darting to the bunny in Michael's grasp. A shy smile tugging at her lips. "Are we really going with you?" Leah asked, her voice quivering with disbelief. Michael knelt to her level, his heart pounding. "Not uncle anymore, Leah. Call me Dad. We're going home." For a heartbeat, she froze, then flung herself into his arms, her whisper barely audible against his chest, "Thank you, Dad." Their new life began in Michael's modest apartment, where he'd poured his soul into a room just for them. The bunk bed stood proudly against the wall, draped in cartoon-themed bedding. A play corner burst with color, and a bookshelf brimmed with fairy tales he couldn't wait to read aloud. When the girls stepped inside, Lila's eyes widened, her breath hitching as she took it in. Leah scanned every detail silently, her fingers brushing the edge of the bed. Then Lila spoke, her voice trembling. "Is this our room?" Michael nodded, sitting on the floor beside them. "Yes. This is our home." Without warning, Lila darted forward, wrapping her arms around his legs. "I've never had a room like this," she murmured, her words dissolving into a sob. Leah joined them, her gaze steady but soft. "Dad. Do you really want to keep us?" Michael rested a hand on her shoulder, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't just want to keep you. You're my family. And I'll always be here." The first days were fragile. Lila woke screaming from nightmares, her cries echoing through the quiet apartment. Michael would stumble from his bed, bleary-eyed but gentle, sitting by her side, humming soft tunes until her breathing steadied. Leah, though tougher, retreated into herself at times, curling into corners with a faraway look. Once, Michael found her tucked behind the couch, her knees drawn to her chest. He didn't push, just sat nearby, offering silent strength until she was ready to emerge. These moments were lessons in justice, proof that power, when wielded with love, could heal, while its abuse left scars that lingered. Michael vowed to be their shield, knowing that every step forward was a triumph over the past that had tried to break them. In the stillness of the night, a faint rustling stirred the quiet air of the small bedroom where Leah slept. Under her pillow, hidden like a fragile secret, were a few dry breadcrumbs. crumbs she'd tucked away with trembling hands. When Michael, her guardian and newfound anchor, knelt beside her bed and asked in a voice as soft as a whisper why she kept them there, Leah's heart fluttered with unease. She hesitated, her eyes darting to the shadows cast by the dim lamplight, before murmuring a weak excuse, "What if there's no food tomorrow?" Her voice quivered, carrying the weight of a past where hunger had gnawed at her small frame, a past she couldn't yet shake. Michael's brow furrowed with concern, but his gaze remained steady and warm. He lowered himself further, resting a reassuring hand on her frail shoulder, his touch a silent promise against the fears that haunted her. "Leah," he said, his tone firm yet tender, "you don't have to carry that worry anymore. I swear to you, this home, our home, will always have food. You'll never feel that emptiness again." His words wrapped around her like a blanket. And though doubt lingered in her chest, Leah felt a flicker of relief. She gave a small, hesitant nod, her wide eyes searching his face for truth. From that fragile moment, a thread of trust began to weave itself between them, delicate but growing stronger with each passing day. For Michael, however, life was a balancing act teetering on the edge of chaos. As a police officer, his days were ruled by the relentless ticking of the clock, long shifts that often pulled him from the house before the first light of dawn kissed the windowsills. Leah and her younger sister, Lila, would still be nestled in their dreams when he slipped out the door, his boots echoing softly on the wooden floor. He couldn't bear the thought of them waking to an empty home, so he turned to Mrs. Johnson, the silver-haired widow next door whose gentle demeanor masked a spine of steel. A retired nurse with hands that had soothed countless fevers, Mrs. Johnson didn't hesitate when Michael knocked on her door one crisp morning. His voice thick with vulnerability as he shared his story. Her eyes, sharp yet kind, softened as she listened. "Michael," she said, placing a wrinkled hand on his arm, "you're a remarkable father. But even the strongest among us can't carry this alone. I'll be there for you and those precious girls whenever you need me." True to her word, she became their guardian angel, watching over Leah and Lila when Michael's badge called him away, teaching him the small, practical arts of parenthood he'd never had the chance to learn. She showed him how to whip up quick snacks, peanut butter on crackers with a drizzle of honey, that sent the girls into fits of delight, their giggles bouncing off the walls. With her steady presence, Michael felt the weight on his shoulders lighten, and a quiet confidence bloomed within him as he stepped more fully into his role. The girls, once shadowed by the ghosts of uncertainty, began to unfurl like flowers after a long winter. Leah, with her cautious eyes and tightly guarded heart, and Lila, whose shy silence spoke volumes, traded their fears for tentative sparks of curiosity and joy. One evening, Michael trudged home after a grueling shift, his uniform rumpled and his bones aching, only to freeze in the doorway at the sight before him. Leah sat cross-legged on the floor, a stubby pencil clutched in her hand, guiding Lila's smaller fingers across a crumpled sheet of paper. "LLA," Leah spelled out patiently, but Lila's scrawl twisted the letters into LEAH instead. A peal of laughter burst from Leah's lips, bright, unguarded, and so startlingly pure that Michael's breath caught in his throat. It was the first time he'd seen their spirits dance so freely since they'd come into his life, and the sound rooted him to the spot, a weary smile tugging at his lips. Every night after that, he carved out time to sit with them, the three of them huddled under a patchwork quilt as the world outside faded away. Sometimes he'd crack open a weathered book of fairy tales, his voice weaving tales of brave princesses and cunning foxes. Other nights, he'd dig into his own childhood, recounting the time he'd fallen into a creek chasing a frog, his animated gestures drawing wide-eyed stares and soft giggles. Leah and Lila drank in every word, their faces glowing in the golden lamplight, their trust in him deepening with each story. One night, as the final words of a tale drifted into silence, Leah's voice broke the stillness. "Dad." She said, the word fragile yet heavy with meaning, we never thought we'd have a home like this. Thank you for not leaving us. Michael's chest tightened, emotion swelling behind his eyes. He leaned down, pressing a kiss to her forehead, his voice thick as he replied, No, Leah, it's me who should thank you. You and Lila, you've given my life a purpose I didn't know I was missing. Life with the girls was far from simple. The days were a tangle of spilled juice, forgotten toys, and the constant hum of small voices, but Michael wouldn't trade a single second of it. His once silent house now buzzed with life, laughter spilling from the kitchen, the patter of feet racing down the hall, the warmth of togetherness seeping into every corner. He knew this was only the beginning, a journey stretching out before him like an uncharted road, but he faced it with a resolve forged in love. Leah and Lila weren't just his duty anymore. They were his heart, his reason, his unshakable future. As months turned into years, the trio wove themselves into a family, their bond tempered by the trials they'd overcome. The day he took them to the nearby preschool marked a turning point, a milestone etched in the quiet pride swelling within him. He rose before the sun. His hands trembling slightly as he packed their lunchboxes, tiny containers brimming with sandwiches, apple slices, and a scribbled note tucked inside each one, Dad's always proud of you. Leah, ever the protector, gripped Lila's hand with a fierceness that belied her own nerves, her knuckles widening as they approached the school gates. Michael noticed the subtle shake in her fingers and dropped to one knee, his hand finding her shoulder once more. Leah, he said, locking eyes with her, you've got this. I'll be right here when the bell rings, and we'll go home together, okay? Her gaze flickered with a storm of fear and hope, but after a long breath, she nodded. Yes, Dad, she whispered. Then squared her shoulders and led Lila through the threshold. Michael stood there, watching their small figures vanish into the bustle of the classroom, his heart a tangled knot of pride and worry. Leah had always shouldered the burden of keeping Lila safe, but now she was stepping into a world where she could finally let go, and trust. The months that followed painted a vivid transformation. Leah and Lila shed their timidity like old skin, their voices growing louder, their smiles brighter. Lila, once a wisp of a girl who clung to silence, began to chatter about her days, new friends she'd made, the thrill of her teacher pinning her first drawing to the wall, its bold colors a testament to her budding spirit. Leah, meanwhile, took on a quiet maturity, her hands busy folding laundry or stirring a pot of soup beside Michael in the kitchen. She'd even sit cross-legged on Lila's bed, reading bedtime stories with a voice that grew steadier each night. Yet beneath her growing ease, Michael sensed a lingering shadow. Leah's need to be perfect gnawed at her, every task executed with precision, every mistake met with a flash of panic, as if one misstep might unravel the life they'd built. One evening, as she scrubbed dishes with a focus that bordered on desperation, Michael gently pulled her aside, settling them both on the worn couch. Leah, he said, his voice soft but insistent. You don't have to get everything right. Just be you, that's more than enough for me. She stared at the floor, her fingers twisting together, until a question slipped out, raw and unguarded. If we mess up, Dad, will you leave us? The words hit Michael like a punch, stealing his breath. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight as his voice broke with emotion. Never, Leah. You don't have to be perfect to be loved. I love you exactly as you are. From that night, the tension in her shoulders began to melt, her smiles coming easier. Her trust in him, and in herself, finally taking root. At the police station, whispers about Michael's choice to take in the girls had once buzzed like flies, sharp with skepticism. But as time wore on, the murmurs faded, replaced by nods of respect. Sergeant O'Reilly, a grizzled man whose doubts had once cut deep, approached Michael's desk one afternoon. His usual gruffness tempered by something softer. Thompson, he said, scratching his beard, I didn't think you had it in you. But you're a damn good father, better than most. Don't know anyone else who'd pull this off. Michael met his gaze, a quiet gratitude settling in his chest. The acknowledgement wasn't necessary, but it steadied him all the same. Then came the day his phone rang with news from social services. His adoption papers were finalized. Leah and Lila were his daughters, not just in heart but in law. That evening, their little home swelled with celebration. Mrs. Johnson arrived with a tray of her famous oatmeal cookies, her eyes crinkling with pride, while a handful of colleagues clapped Michael on the back. Leah and Lila twirled in new dresses, their laughter mingling with the clink of glasses. In the midst of it all, Leah stepped forward, her voice cutting through the noise. "Dad," she said. Her eyes shimmering, "we used to think no one wanted us. Now we know we've got a family, and we're so thankful for you." Tears pricked Michael's eyes as he crossed the room, wrapping them both in a hug that felt like a vow. The years stretched ahead, filled with bike rides and kitchen mishaps, school plays where Leah shone and drawings where Lila poured her soul. One quiet night, as they sprawled across the couch, Leah's voice broke the stillness. "Dad, do we ever wear you out?" Michael chuckled, pulling them close. "You're not just my pride and joy," he said. His voice warm with truth, "You're my everything." Through it all, the lessons of justice and consequence loomed large. Michael, a man who'd sworn to uphold the law, knew its limits, how power, when wielded carelessly, could shatter lives like Leah and Lila's had once been. His choice to take them in wasn't just an act of compassion. It was a stand against the failures of a system that had left them adrift. Every step he took was a testament to the idea that true justice wasn't found in punishment alone, but in restoration. In rebuilding what had been broken. And for Leah, who'd learned too young that trust could be a gamble, Michael's unwavering presence taught her a deeper truth, that power, when rooted in love, could heal. Together, they turned the ashes of neglect into a life rich with meaning, proving that the consequences of kindness could ripple far beyond the moment it was given. On a frigid winter night, the wind howled through the desolate streets, carrying with it the sting of frost and the faint echo of despair. In a shadowed alley, where the dim flicker of a street lamp barely pierced the gloom, Michael stood, his breath forming fleeting clouds in the icy air. His heart pounded, not from the cold, but from a fierce, unshakable resolve that had taken root deep within him. Before him stood Leah and Lila, two small figures bundled in tattered coats, their wide eyes reflecting a mixture of fear, exhaustion, and a fragile glimmer of trust. As they looked up at him, their tiny arms reached out, trembling not just from the chill but from the weight of a life that had offered them little kindness. In that moment, they wrapped him in a hug so tight it felt as though they were clinging to him for dear life, and perhaps they were. Michael's chest tightened as their warmth seeped through his worn jacket, thawing something inside him he hadn't even realized was frozen. His arms encircled them instinctively, pulling them closer. And a tidal wave of emotion crashed over him. He wasn't just their savior in that dark, forsaken alley, he understood, with a clarity that struck him like lightning, that they were his salvation too. Leah, with her quiet strength and the way she bit her lip to hold back tears, and Lila, with her restless energy and the spark of defiance in her gaze, they had given him something he'd never known he was missing. Faith, fragile but growing like a seedling in spring. Hope, a flickering flame that refused to die. And purpose, a steady compass guiding him through a life that had once felt aimless and gray. As he held them, the world seemed to shift beneath his feet. And he knew he'd never be the same. Their journey didn't end in that alley, it was only the beginning. The days that followed were a tapestry woven with threads of struggle and triumph, each stitch binding them closer together. Michael remembered the first night he brought them to the small, creaky house he'd called home, a place that had once felt hollow, its walls echoing with silence. Now, those walls bore witness to something new. Leah sat cross-legged on the faded rug. Her brow furrowed as she traced her fingers over the pages of a book he'd found at a thrift store, her soft voice stumbling over the words as she taught herself to read. Lila, meanwhile, darted around the room like a firefly, her laughter bouncing off the ceiling as she chased shadows and spun wild tales of imaginary adventures. The air smelled of burnt toast and cheap coffee. The remnants of Michael's clumsy attempts to make them breakfast, but to him, it was the sweetest scent in the world, a sign of life, of family. Outside, the seasons turned. Snow melted into muddy puddles, then gave way to the tender green of spring and the golden haze of summer. The house, once a shell, transformed into a sanctuary. A rickety porch swing creaked under their weight as they sat together on warm evenings, Leah nestled against Michael's side while Lila dangled her legs, kicking at the air. They'd watched the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, and Michael would feel a quiet awe settle over him. He hadn't just rescued 2 children from a tragic fate, he'd built something enduring, something real. Leah and Lila weren't bound to him by blood, but by something far stronger. Love that had weathered storms, compassion that had bridged the gap between their broken pasts, and sacrifice that had forged them into a family. Before that night in the alley, Michael's life had been a series of muted tones, days blending into nights, each as cold and unremarkable as the last. He'd wandered through them like a ghost. His heart a locked door he'd forgotten how to open. But Leah and Lila had changed everything. They'd once lived in a world shrouded in neglect, where hunger gnawed at their bellies and the shadows held more threats than comfort. Leah, the older of the 2, had carried the burden of protecting her little sister. Her young shoulders hunched under the weight of responsibility no child should bear. She'd whisper reassurances to Lila in the dark, her voice steady even as her own stomach growled. Lila, restless and fierce, had fought back against their misery in her own way, kicking at the dirt, her small fists clenched as if she could punch through the unfairness of it all. They'd been invisible to the world, 2 lost souls fading into the cracks, until Michael saw them. That night, as he crouched before them in the alley, his voice had been soft but firm. Promising them safety, promising them a chance. He didn't know then that he was promising himself something too, a reason to keep going, a light to chase away his own darkness. Now, as he watched them grow, he marveled at their resilience. Leah's cautious smiles bloomed into laughter, her eyes bright with dreams she dared to speak aloud. Lila's wild energy found a home in playful antics, her chatter filling the quiet corners of their lives. They'd given him joy he'd never thought possible. A happiness that felt like sunlight spilling through a window after years of rain. Their story stretched beyond the walls of that little house, rippling outward like a stone dropped into still water. It was a living testament to a truth as old as time: family isn't defined by shared bloodlines but by the bonds forged in the crucible of care and courage. Michael hadn't just saved Leah and Lila, he'd shown them a path out of the shadows, into a future where they could stand tall. And in return, they'd pulled him from his own abyss. Proving that even the smallest act of kindness can rewrite someone's entire world. Think of Mrs. Carter, the gray-haired neighbor who lived across the street. Her porch cluttered with chipped flower pots and wind chimes that sang in the breeze. She'd watched Michael's transformation with keen eyes. Her lips curling into a knowing smile as she handed him a basket of warm muffins one crisp morning. "You've got a good heart, Michael," she'd said, her voice raspy but warm. "Those girls, they're lucky to have you, and you're lucky to have them." She'd seen the way Leah and Lila ran to him after school, their backpacks bouncing, their faces alight with trust. Mrs. Carter, who'd once lost a son to a war she rarely spoke of, found her own solace in their laughter, her days a little less lonely because of it. Or consider Tommy, the wiry mechanic at the garage where Michael worked, his hands stained with grease and his grin perpetually lopsided. He'd tease Michael about his newfound softness, gone from lone wolf to family man, huh? But there was admiration in his tone. Tommy had his own struggles, a brother lost to addiction. And he'd linger after shifts to hear about Leah's latest book or Lila's backyard treasure hunts, his eyes distant but grateful for a glimpse of something good. This journey wasn't just about adoption or the quiet pride of fatherhood, it was a clarion call to the world. It whispered to anyone who'd listen, pay attention, show care. Step forward when someone's hand is reaching out from the dark. Michael had become a beacon, not because he was extraordinary, but because he'd chosen to act. He'd faced challenges, a leaking roof, a meager paycheck, the weight of 2 young lives depending on him, and he'd risen to meet them, bolstered by the unshakable truth that he wasn't alone anymore. Their tale carried a deeper lesson. One etched in the lines of Michael's weathered face and the brightness of Leah and Lila's eyes: justice isn't just a grand ideal, but a quiet, personal stand against the wrongs of the world. Michael had righted an injustice, not with fanfare, but with a steady hand extended in love. And yet, it warned of power's shadow too. Had he turned away that night, left them to fate's cruelty, he'd have wielded the power of indifference, a choice with consequences as grave as any abuse of authority. Instead, he'd chosen mercy, and in doing so, he'd rewritten 3 lives. So if this story stirs something in you, a pang of recognition, a spark of resolve, let it move you. Share it with a friend over coffee, recount it to your family around a flickering fire. Let it echo in the spaces where hope is needed most. Because in a world tangled with trials, one heartfelt act can ripple outward, creating miracles where none seemed possible. Michael, Leah, and Lila, they're proof of that.